That gnawing feeling when everyone else seems to have their life mapped out perfectly, while you're standing in the supermarket aisle wondering what you're even doing there. If that hits close to home, take a breath. You're not broken. You're not behind. You're exactly where countless wise beings have stood before discovering something profound. The Buddha himself spent 6 years wandering, searching, feeling utterly lost. The greatest Zen masters speak of "don't know mind" as the doorway to truth. What if your confusion isn't a problem to solve, but a crack where light gets in? If it feels right, share in the comments where you're listening from, your city, your cozy corner, maybe just my car during lunch break. There's something beautiful about knowing we're scattered across the world, yet feeling the same human uncertainty together. Find a comfortable spot if you can. Maybe grab that soft blanket or settle into your favorite chair. This isn't about fixing yourself in the next 3 hours. It's about discovering that the very place where you feel most lost might be exactly where your authentic path begins. We're going to explore ancient remedies for modern restlessness. Not quick fixes, but gentle wisdom that's helped humans navigate uncertainty for over 2,000 years. Ready to discover why being lost might be the most honest place to start. You've been carrying a weight that was never yours to hold. The belief that, by now, at your age, with your experience, after all you've been through, you should have clarity about your direction, your purpose, your next step. But what if that entire framework is built on a foundation of cultural mythology? What if the idea that humans are supposed to have it all figured out is one of the most damaging lies our society perpetuates? Consider this for a moment. When you were 5 years old, did anyone expect you to know what you wanted for dinner next Thursday? Of course not. Yet somehow, we've created this bizarre expectation that by 25, 35, or 55, you should have mapped out the rest of your existence. The Buddha discovered something revolutionary 2,500 years ago that directly challenges this assumption. He realized that the very desire for certainty, the grasping for solid ground in an inherently fluid world, is what creates our deepest suffering. Think about the last time you felt genuinely peaceful. I'm willing to bet it wasn't when you had every detail of your future planned out. It was probably a moment when you were fully present, watching a sunset, laughing with a friend, or simply breathing without agenda. That's because peace doesn't come from knowing where you're going. It comes from being comfortable with where you are. Buddhism offers something radical that our achievement-obsessed culture struggles to understand. The teaching of radical acceptance doesn't mean becoming passive or giving up on growth. It means recognizing that this moment, exactly as it is, confusion and all, is already complete. Your uncertainty isn't evidence of failure. It's evidence of honesty. It means you're no longer pretending to know things you don't know, no longer performing a version of yourself that was never quite authentic anyway. The Zen tradition has a beautiful phrase for this state: don't know mind. It's considered one of the most precious things a human being can cultivate. Not ignorance, but the wisdom to recognize the limits of what any individual mind can truly grasp about existence. When you're in don't know mind, you're not constantly defending outdated beliefs about who you should be. You're not exhausting yourself trying to maintain an image that never quite fit anyway. You're free to respond to life as it actually unfolds, rather than as you think it should unfold. This creates space for something beautiful to emerge. Curiosity instead of judgment, openness instead of resistance. The kind of presence that allows you to notice opportunities you would have missed while frantically trying to execute a rigid plan. But let's be honest about why this feels so threatening. We live in a culture that mistakes activity for progress, plans for wisdom, and certainty for strength. Admitting you don't know where you're going can feel like admitting failure. Yet consider the greatest innovations, the most meaningful relationships, the moments that actually changed your life. How many of them went according to plan? How many emerged from periods of uncertainty, confusion, or what you might have called being lost at the time? Steve Jobs spoke about this when he said, "You can only connect the dots looking backward." The computer science courses that seemed random at the time became essential to creating the Mac. The calligraphy class he took for fun revolutionized digital typography. The period when he was fired from his own company led to some of his most innovative work. What looked like detours were actually the path. What felt like being lost was actually being guided. There's an ancient story that illustrates this beautifully. A fisherman was drifting down a river in his small boat, when suddenly another boat came careening toward him through the morning mist. "Move," he shouted. "You're going to crash into me." But the boat kept coming, faster and faster, until it slammed directly into his vessel. The fisherman was furious. He stood up, ready to unleash his anger at the careless boater who had just ruined his peaceful morning. But as the mist cleared, he saw that the other boat was empty. It had simply broken free from its mooring and was drifting with the current. Immediately, his anger dissolved. He simply pushed the empty boat away and continued on his journey. The Taoist sage Chuang Tzu, who first told this story, asks us to consider, what if all the boats that crash into us in life are empty? What if the circumstances that disrupt our plans, the people who disappoint us, the unexpected turns that leave us feeling lost, what if none of it is personal? What if feeling lost isn't something happening to you, but something happening through you? A natural movement of life that's trying to take you somewhere you couldn't plan your way to? Think about it this way. Every tree that grows in a forest encounters obstacles, rocks in the soil, other trees blocking sunlight, storms that bend their branches. Does the tree spend its energy being angry at these obstacles? Does it feel like a failure when it has to grow around a boulder instead of through it? Of course not. The tree simply adapts. It finds a way around, over, or through. Sometimes these adaptations create the most beautiful and distinctive shapes. The obstacles become part of the tree's unique character. Your periods of confusion might be serving the same function. They're forcing you to adapt, to grow in directions you never would have chosen, but that ultimately make you more resilient, more creative, more authentically yourself. This shift in perspective changes everything. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" you begin to ask, "What is this trying to show me?" Instead of resisting the uncertainty, you become curious about what it might be clearing space for. Buddhism teaches that what we call confusion is often the mind's way of releasing old patterns that no longer serve us. Like a computer clearing its cache, the periods when nothing seems clear are often when the deepest reorganization is happening. You know that feeling when you're trying to remember someone's name, and the harder you try, the more elusive it becomes. But then later, when you're thinking about something completely different, the name suddenly pops into your consciousness. That's because your mind was working on the problem in the background, in ways that conscious effort couldn't access. Your periods of confusion might be serving a similar function. The answers you're looking for might be forming in the depths of your awareness, but they need space to emerge naturally. You're not falling apart. You're falling together in a new way. But this requires a fundamental shift in how you measure your worth. Our culture teaches us to value ourselves based on achievements, accumulations, and the appearance of having our act together. Buddhism suggests something entirely different. Your worth isn't based on what you've figured out. It's based on your willingness to keep showing up, to keep breathing, to keep being present, even when presence feels uncomfortable. The most profound spiritual teachers throughout history share a common thread. They're not the ones who figured everything out early and never wavered. They're the ones who learned to find peace within uncertainty, wisdom within confusion, and strength within vulnerability. The Dalai Lama was forced to flee his homeland as a young man. Thich Nhat Hanh has exiled from Vietnam for his peace work. Pema Chodron went through a devastating divorce that shattered her conventional life. Their wisdom didn't come from avoiding confusion and loss. It came from learning to transform those experiences into compassion. Your confusion isn't a bug in the system. It's a feature. It's your psyche's way of refusing to settle for answers that don't actually fit your lived experience. It's your inner wisdom saying, "We need to go deeper." Consider how arrogant it would be to assume that your individual mind, with its limited perspective and culturally conditioned assumptions, should be able to figure out the meaning and direction of an existence that's part of an incomprehensibly vast and complex universe. When you really think about it, feeling lost is the only honest response to being a finite being in an infinite cosmos. It's humility disguised as confusion. This doesn't mean you stop making plans or setting intentions. It means you hold them lightly. You recognize them as helpful tools rather than sacred contracts. You remain open to course corrections, unexpected opportunities, and the possibility that life might have a better plan than the one you've constructed. Think of your plans like a GPS system. When you're driving and the GPS says, recalculating route, you don't pull over and have an existential crisis. You trust that the system is finding a better path based on current conditions. Your periods of confusion might be life's way of saying, recalculating route. In Zen practice, there's a saying, don't seek the truth, just drop your opinions. Most of what we call being lost is actually being attached to opinions about how our life should look. When those opinions no longer match reality, we suffer. But what if, instead of trying to force reality to match your opinions, you became curious about what reality is actually offering? What if your confusion is just life's way of saying, pay attention, something new is trying to emerge? The Vietnamese Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh once said that the most precious gift we can offer others is our presence. But how can you be truly present if you're constantly worried about whether you're going in the right direction? How can you listen deeply if you're rehearsing your next move? Feeling lost, paradoxically, can make you more present than feeling certain ever could. When you don't know what comes next, you're forced to pay attention to what's here now. And what's here now is always enough to work with. Always. Your breath is here. Your capacity to feel is here. Your ability to choose your next response is here. These are not small things. These are the building blocks of every meaningful life ever lived. When you stop demanding that this moment be different, you start to notice what it actually contains. Maybe it's the taste of your morning coffee, really tasted for the first time in months. Maybe it's the way light falls across your room. Maybe it's simply the miracle of your heart beating without any effort from you. These moments of presence aren't consolation prizes for not having your life figured out. They're the actual prize. They're what all the planning and achieving is supposed to be in service of. So here's your permission slip, written by 25 centuries of Buddhist wisdom. You don't have to have it figured out. You never did. You're allowed to be exactly where you are, feeling exactly what you're feeling, knowing exactly as much as you know and no more. You're allowed to be human, beautifully, imperfectly, authentically human. And sometimes, being human means feeling like an empty boat, drifting down a river, not sure where the current is taking you, but trusting that the river knows the way to the sea. The ancient teachers remind us that confusion is often the beginning of wisdom, not its absence. That questions can be more valuable than answers. That the willingness to say, I don't know, is the first step toward knowing something real. So take a breath. Feel your feet on the ground. Notice that you're still here, still breathing, still capable of this moment of awareness. That's not nothing. That's everything. There's something almost magical that happens when you watch a child encounter something for the first time. Maybe it's their first snowfall, their first glimpse of the ocean, or simply the way sunlight catches in a soap bubble. Their eyes widen, their whole body becomes alert, and for that moment, they're completely absorbed in wonder. No analysis, no comparison to previous experiences, no mental filing system cataloging the moment into familiar categories. Just pure, unfiltered presence with what is. This is what Zen Buddhism calls Shoshin, beginner's mind. And it might be the most powerful antidote to feeling lost that has ever been discovered. The irony is profound. In a culture obsessed with expertise, credentials, and having the right answers, the ancient wisdom traditions point us toward something entirely different. They suggest that the more we think we know, the less we're actually able to see. Shunryu Suzuki, the Japanese Zen master who brought this teaching to the West, put it simply, in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind, there are few. Think about that for a moment. When you approach something as an expert, you're filtering every new piece of information through existing categories. You know what to expect, what patterns to look for, what outcomes are likely. This can be useful, certainly, but it can also blind you to what's actually happening right in front of you. The expert mind says, "I've seen this before." The beginner's mind says, "What is this?" One closes down possibilities, the other opens them up. This is why so many breakthrough discoveries come not from the leading experts in a field, but from people who approach familiar problems with fresh eyes. Einstein's theory of relativity emerged partly because he was willing to question assumptions about time and space that physicists had taken for granted for centuries. He approached the fundamental questions of physics with what we might call a beginner's mind. But here's what's particularly relevant for those moments when you feel lost. Beginner's mind doesn't require you to know where you're going. In fact, it works best when you don't. When you're in true beginner's mind, you're not trying to get somewhere specific. You're not measuring your progress against some predetermined outcome. You're simply paying attention to what's actually here, what's actually happening, what's actually emerging in this moment. This is radically different from how most of us were taught to navigate life. We're told to set goals, make plans, develop expertise, become authorities in our chosen fields. All of which can be valuable, but which can also trap us in increasingly narrow ways of seeing. The Buddha himself discovered this 2,500 years ago. Before his awakening, he had become an expert in the spiritual practices of his time. He could perform extreme austerities that would have killed most people. He had mastered meditation techniques that few could even attempt. He was, by any measure, a spiritual expert. And yet all of this expertise wasn't bringing him the peace he sought. It wasn't until he abandoned his expert knowledge and sat under the Bodhi tree with what we might call complete beginner's mind, that awakening became possible. He later said, "In the sky, there is no distinction of east and west. People create distinctions out of their own minds and then believe them to be true." What he was pointing to is how our mental categories, our expertise, our knowledge, our certainty about how things work can become barriers to seeing clearly. The sky doesn't actually have an east or west. Those are human constructs that we overlay onto reality. Similarly, the feeling of being lost might not be a real problem that needs solving. It might be a mental construct we overlay onto the natural uncertainty of existence. When you approach your confusion with beginner's mind, everything changes. Instead of seeing it as evidence that you're behind or broken, you become curious about it. You ask, what is this feeling actually like? How does it show up in my body? What thoughts accompany it? What happens if I don't immediately try to fix it? This kind of investigation isn't passive. It's one of the most active, engaging things you can do. It requires presence, attention, and courage. But it also brings an immediate sense of relief because you're no longer at war with your experience. You're studying it instead of suffering from it. Let me share a story that illustrates this beautifully. There was once a master calligrapher in ancient China who was renowned throughout the country for his skill. Students traveled from far and wide to learn from him, and emperors commissioned him to create works for their palaces. One day, a young student approached him and said, "Master, I have been practicing calligraphy for 10 years. I know all the traditional forms. I can write in multiple styles, and my technique is flawless. Yet when I see your work, I realize I am still a beginner. How can this be?" The master smiled and handed the student a brush. "Show me how you write the character for water," he said. The student took the brush and executed the character perfectly. Every stroke was precise. Every proportion was correct, according to the classical rules. It was technically flawless. The master nodded approvingly. "Now," he said, "write it again, but this time, forget everything you know about calligraphy. Instead, think about water itself. Feel its fluidity, its capacity to take any shape, its ability to carve through stone with gentleness. Let the character emerge from your understanding of water, not from your knowledge of proper technique." The student hesitated. This went against everything he had learned. But he took a breath, closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, he wrote the character again. This time, something was different. The strokes had the same technical accuracy, but they also had life. They seemed to flow like actual water. The character didn't just represent water, it embodied it. "You see," the master said gently, "your expertise taught you how to write correctly. But beginner's mind teaches you how to write truthfully. Correctness is valuable, but truth is alive. This story captures something essential about why beginner's mind is such a powerful remedy for feeling lost. When you're lost, you're already in a state where your usual expertise isn't working. Your familiar approaches, your tried and true strategies, your knowledge about how life is supposed to work. None of it seems to apply to your current situation. This can feel terrifying if you're attached to being the expert in your own life. But it can feel liberating if you're willing to embrace beginner's mind. Because when you don't know what you're doing, you're forced to pay attention to what's actually happening. You can't rely on autopilot. You can't just apply a formula you learned before. You have to be present, responsive, alive to the moment. Think about learning to ride a bicycle. No amount of theoretical knowledge about balance, momentum, and steering can substitute for the moment-to-moment attention required when you're actually on the bike. You have to feel your way into it, make countless micro-adjustments, and develop an intuitive sense of how to respond to each wobble. Life is like that bicycle. The moments when you feel most lost are often the moments when you're being asked to develop new balance, new responsiveness, new ways of navigating that can't be learned from a book or inherited from past experience. But our culture makes this incredibly difficult because it's so uncomfortable with not knowing. We live in an information age where ignorance feels like a moral failing. If you don't know something, you can Google it in seconds. If you can't figure something out, you can find an expert to tell you what to do. This creates an illusion that all confusion should be quickly resolvable. But the deepest questions of human existence, questions about meaning, purpose, love, death, and how to live authentically, these don't have Googleable answers. They require what Zen calls don't know mind. Not the absence of intelligence, but a quality of openness that allows new understanding to emerge. The Korean Zen master Shung-san taught extensively about this state. He would often challenge his students by asking them seemingly impossible questions. When they tried to give clever answers or quote Buddhist philosophy, he would ring a bell and say, "Don't know." He wasn't being dismissive. He was pointing them toward a state of mind that's more interested in truth than in sounding smart. A state where you're willing to sit with uncertainty until genuine insight arises. This don't know mind is not passive waiting. It's active not knowing. It's like the difference between being confused and being curious. Confusion resists the unknown and tries to force understanding. Curiosity embraces the unknown and investigates it with interest. Let's try a simple exercise to taste this quality of mind right now. Look around your environment and find something you see every day. Maybe it's a coffee cup, a houseplant, a book on your shelf. Something so familiar that you normally don't really notice it anymore. Now, imagine you're seeing this object for the very first time. You don't know what it's called or what it's used for. You're simply encountering it as a pure phenomenon. What do you actually see? Not what you know about it, but what's actually there for your senses to discover. What's the quality of light reflecting off its surface? What's its texture, its weight, its relationship to the space around it? If you can do this even for a few moments, you'll notice something interesting. The object becomes more vivid, more alive, more interesting than it was when you were seeing it through the filter of familiarity. You might notice details you've never seen before, even though you've looked at this thing hundreds of times. This is what beginner's mind does to everything, including your own life. It makes the familiar fresh again. It reveals aspects of your experience that expertise and familiarity had made invisible. You can apply this same quality of attention to your feelings of being lost. Instead of immediately labeling the feeling as a problem, what if you investigated it with the same curiosity you just brought to that familiar object? What does feeling lost actually feel like in your body? Is it a tightness in your chest? A fluttering in your stomach? A fog in your mind? Does it have a color, a temperature, a texture? What thoughts accompany this feeling? Not the content of the thoughts. We all know the stories our minds tell when we feel confused, but the actual quality of thinking itself. Is it rapid or slow? Circular or linear? Tight or spacious? When you investigate your experience with this kind of fresh attention, something remarkable happens. The feeling doesn't necessarily go away, but it loses its solid, problematic quality. It becomes more like weather, something you can experience without being overwhelmed by. This is because beginner's mind naturally creates space around whatever you're experiencing. When you're not immediately trying to categorize, fix, or escape from something, you're able to hold it more lightly. You realize that even confusion has its own intelligence. It might be your psyche's way of saying that your old approaches to life aren't working anymore, that it's time to find new ways of being. It might be a sign that you're outgrowing limitations you didn't even know you had. The Buddha spoke about this when he described the mind in its natural state as being like space itself. He said, "All formations are impermanent. All formations arise and pass away. But awareness itself is like space, vast, clear, and unobstructed. It can hold anything without being disturbed by what it contains." This pointing to the spacious quality of awareness is one of Buddhism's most profound gifts. It suggests that your essential nature is not the confused person trying to figure things out. Your essential nature is the awareness that can hold confusion without being confused by it. When you rest in beginner's mind, you're resting in that spacious awareness. You're not identified with any particular state or story. You're simply present with whatever is arising, curious about how life is expressing itself through you in this moment. This doesn't mean you become passive or stop caring about your life's direction. It means you become more responsive to what's actually needed, rather than what you think should be needed. You start to move from a place of aliveness rather than anxiety. You begin to trust that not knowing everything is not only okay, but necessary. That staying open to new possibilities is more valuable than clinging to old certainties. That curiosity is a more reliable guide than expertise when you're navigating uncharted territory. And the beautiful thing about beginner's mind is that it's always available. No matter how much you think you know, no matter how expert you've become in any area of life, you can always choose to meet this moment with fresh eyes. You can always ask, what don't I know about this situation? What am I not seeing? What would it be like to approach this with complete openness? These questions don't diminish your intelligence or experience. They expand it. They create space for wisdom to emerge that your expertise alone could never access. So the next time you feel lost, consider it an invitation into beginner's mind. A chance to see your life with fresh eyes, to discover aspects of yourself and your situation that familiarity had hidden. An opportunity to remember that not knowing is not a problem to solve, but a space to explore. In that space, new possibilities can emerge. Not the possibilities your expert mind thinks are reasonable, but the ones that can only be discovered by approaching life with the wonder of a child seeing snow for the first time. That wonder is still available to you. It's waiting just behind your need to know, your fear of being wrong, your attachment to appearing competent. All you have to do is set those aside for a moment and ask, what is this? The answer might surprise you. There's an ancient story that maps the human journey of awakening better than any modern psychology textbook ever written. It's called the 10 Bulls Parable, and for over 1,000 years, it's been helping people understand that feeling lost isn't a detour from the spiritual path. It's often the very beginning of it. The story follows a young herder who loses his bull and must search for it through 10 distinct stages. But this isn't really about cattle. The bull represents your authentic self. That part of you that's always been there but somehow got lost in the noise of expectations, conditioning, and the endless effort to become someone you thought you should be. What makes this parable so powerful is that it doesn't romanticize the journey. It shows that finding yourself is messy, non-linear, and often frustrating. But it also shows that every stage, even the confusion, even the setbacks, serves a purpose in your overall awakening. Let's begin with the first stage of this journey, searching for the bull. This is where most people find themselves when they first realize something is missing. Maybe you're successful by external standards but feel empty inside. Maybe you're following a path that made sense 5 years ago, but now feels like wearing clothes that no longer fit. Maybe you wake up each morning wondering, is this it? Is this really my life? In modern terms, this is the quarter-life crisis, the midlife crisis, the post-graduation panic, or any moment when the life you've built no longer matches who you're becoming. You know something's wrong, but you can't quite name what it is. You start reading self-help books, maybe try therapy, perhaps experiment with meditation or spiritual practices. You're searching, but you don't even know exactly what you're looking for. The herder in the story wanders through forests and valleys, calling out for his bull, but hearing only his own echo. This stage can last years. It's characterized by a vague but persistent feeling that you're living someone else's life, that your real self is somewhere else, doing something else, being someone else. What makes this stage particularly challenging is that everyone around you might think you have it all figured out. You might even have achieved what society considers success. But there's this nagging sense that you're performing a role rather than living authentically. Think about Emma, a marketing executive who described this stage perfectly. I had the corner office, the six-figure salary, the respect of my colleagues. But every morning I'd sit in my car before going into work and feel this overwhelming sense of dread. Not because my job was terrible, but because it felt like I was putting on a costume and pretending to be someone I wasn't. I just didn't know who I actually was underneath the performance. The natural remedy here isn't to search harder, but to honor the longing itself. That restlessness is your inner wisdom, refusing to settle for a life that's too small for who you're becoming. It's your authentic self, like the bull in the story, calling to you from somewhere beyond the boundaries of your current existence. The second stage emerges when you begin finding the tracks. Eventually, you start to notice patterns. Maybe you realize that you feel most alive when you're creating something, even though your job involves no creativity whatsoever. Maybe you notice that certain conversations light you up, while others drain your energy. Maybe you start paying attention to what you were drawn to as a child before the world told you it wasn't practical. Sarah, a corporate lawyer, experienced this beautifully. I started noticing that I would find excuses to walk through the design department at work. I'd linger by their computers, fascinated by what they were creating. At first, I told myself I was just curious. But then I realized these were tracks, breadcrumbs, leading me back to something I'd loved but abandoned in college, when everyone told me art wasn't a real career. The tracks might show up as recurring dreams, persistent interests that seem impractical, or moments when you feel like you're channeling some deeper part of yourself. They're subtle at first, easy to dismiss as coincidence or wishful thinking. You might notice that you always stop to read articles about certain topics, that you're drawn to specific environments, or that you feel energized after particular types of activities. But this stage teaches you to become a detective of your own authenticity. You start tracking what energizes you versus what depletes you, what feels like expansion versus contraction, what aligns with your values versus what you do out of obligation. You begin to pay attention to your body's wisdom, how it relaxes in certain situations and tenses in others. The natural remedy is developing what we might call authentic awareness, the ability to notice and honor these subtle signals from your deeper self. Most people have been trained to ignore these tracks in favor of more practical considerations. But the tracks are your compass, pointing toward what's real. They're your bull, leaving footprints in the soil of your daily experience. Then comes the breakthrough moment of the third stage, seeing the bull. Suddenly, you catch a glimpse of who you really are beneath all the conditioning. It might happen during meditation, in nature, in the middle of a conversation, or while engaged in something you love. For a moment, the fog clears and you see yourself clearly. One person described it this way: I was helping my neighbor with her garden, and suddenly I realized I'd been happy for 3 straight hours without thinking about it. Not the effortful kind of happiness where you're trying to be positive, just natural contentment. I looked at my hands in the soil and thought, this is me. This is who I am when I'm not trying to be anyone. These moments of seeing can be profound or subtle. Maybe it's the way you feel when you're helping someone solve a problem, when you're explaining something you're passionate about, or when you're moving your body in a way that feels natural. Maybe it's recognizing yourself in a character, in a book, or feeling deeply moved by a piece of music that seems to speak your inner language. But here's what the parable teaches us about this stage. Seeing the bull and catching it are 2 very different things. Just because you've glimpsed your authentic self doesn't mean you can immediately integrate it into your daily life. In fact, the glimpse often makes your current situation feel even more confusing, because now you know what you're missing. Many people get stuck here, becoming spiritual seekers who are always chasing the next peak experience, the next moment of clarity. They think awakening is about having more and more of these glimpses. They might jump from workshop to workshop, teacher to teacher, experience to experience, trying to recreate that moment of recognition. The natural remedy at this stage is learning to trust what you've seen, even when you can't access it. That glimpse of your authentic self wasn't a fluke. It was a preview of who you are when you're not performing, defending, or trying to meet others' expectations. It was your bull revealing itself, showing you that it's real and that it can be found. The 4th stage brings us to where the real wrestling begins, catching the bull. You've seen who you really are, but actually living from that place requires dismantling years of conditioning. This is where the real work starts, and it's often the most challenging part of the journey. The bull in the parable is wild and strong. It doesn't want to be caught. Similarly, your authentic self might feel dangerous to the part of you that's been trying to stay safe through conformity. Your family might not recognize this new version of you. Your career might not accommodate your emerging values. Your social circle might resist the changes you're making. This stage is characterized by internal and external resistance. You know who you are, but living it feels risky. The old you was familiar, even if it wasn't fulfilling. This new you requires courage you're not sure you have. You might find yourself sabotaging your own progress, returning to old patterns just when things start to shift. Mark, a software engineer who realized he wanted to be a teacher, described this stage. It wasn't just about changing careers. It was about acknowledging that everything I'd built my identity around, being logical, practical, financially successful, wasn't who I really was. My parents were confused. My friends thought I was having a breakdown. And honestly, some days, I wondered if they were right. The bull was there, but every time I got close to it, something inside me would panic and let go. The natural remedy here is what Buddhism calls right effort, the middle way between forcing change and giving up entirely. You're learning to honor your authentic impulses while being realistic about the pace of transformation. Some changes can happen immediately. Others require patience and strategic planning. You're developing what we might call courageous patience, the ability to stay committed to your truth while honoring the complexity of change. Gradually, you move into the fifth stage, taming the bull. You begin to integrate your authentic self into daily life. The wild bull becomes more cooperative. You're no longer at war with yourself, constantly choosing between who you are and who you think you should be. This doesn't mean life becomes easy. It means you develop skill in navigating the tension between authenticity and practicality. You learn how to honor your values within imperfect circumstances. You discover that being true to yourself doesn't require becoming a different person overnight. It requires becoming more fully who you already are. At this stage, you might still work in the same job, but you approach it differently. You might stay in the same relationship, but you show up more honestly. You begin to find ways to express your authentic self within the structures of your existing life. You start making small but significant changes that align your outer life with your inner truth. Lisa, an accountant who discovered her love for writing, exemplified this stage. I didn't quit my job immediately, but I started writing for an hour each morning before work. I began having more honest conversations with my partner about what mattered to me. I said no to social commitments that felt draining, and yes to activities that fed my creativity. Slowly, my whole life began to align with who I really was. The bull was still wild sometimes, but we were learning to work together. The natural remedy is developing what we might call integration skills, the ability to honor your authentic self while still meeting your responsibilities and maintaining important relationships. This requires patience, creativity, and the wisdom to know when to compromise and when to stand firm. You're learning that authenticity isn't about dramatic gestures. It's about consistent small choices that honor your truth. The sixth stage brings us to riding the bull home, where effortlessness begins to emerge. The struggle between your authentic self and your conditioned self starts to resolve. You're no longer fighting to be yourself. You're simply being yourself. There's a sense of coming home that brings deep peace. At this stage, decisions become clearer because you have a reliable internal compass. You can feel when something aligns with your values and when it doesn't. You trust your intuition more than external opinions. There's less second guessing, less anxiety about making the right choice. You begin to move through life with a quality of presence that others notice. People often comment on changes they see in you during this stage. There's less anxiety, less need to prove yourself, less reactive behavior. You're present in a way you weren't before because you're no longer divided against yourself. The constant internal negotiation between who you are and who you should be begins to quiet. But here's what's particularly interesting about the traditional parable. This isn't the end of the journey. In fact, the next stages suggest that even finding and integrating your authentic self is just preparation for something deeper. The bull that you worked so hard to find and tame begins to seem less important than the awareness that found it. The seventh stage reveals something profound: the bull forgotten, self alone. At this stage, even the effort to be authentic begins to fall away. You're no longer thinking about whether you're being true to yourself, because authenticity has become your natural state. The bull, that symbol of your authentic self that you worked so hard to find and tame, is no longer needed as a separate concept. This might sound abstract, but it has very practical implications. You stop monitoring yourself constantly. Stop asking, "Am I being authentic enough?" You begin to trust that when you're present and honest, your actions will naturally align with your deepest values. The self-consciousness about being authentic fades because you're no longer performing authenticity, you're simply living it. There's a simplicity to this stage that people find deeply restful. The internal committee that used to debate every decision becomes quieter. You act from a place of clarity rather than analysis. It's like the difference between thinking about riding a bicycle and simply riding it. The mechanics become unconscious and natural. The eighth stage takes this even further, both bull and self forgotten. This stage points to something that goes beyond personal authenticity altogether. Even the sense of being a separate self who needs to find their path begins to dissolve. You realize that the very search for yourself was based on the assumption that you were lost to begin with. In psychological terms, this is the dissolution of the ego's need to have a special identity. You're no longer invested in being someone in particular. There's a profound letting go of the need to be anybody at all. This doesn't mean you become passive or lose your individuality. It means you stop clinging to any fixed idea of who you are. You become more like water, responsive to whatever container life provides, while never losing your essential nature. The ninth stage brings us to returning to the source. Here, you realize that what you were searching for was never actually lost. The journey of finding yourself was necessary, but now you understand that your essential nature was always present, just obscured by the belief that you needed to become someone else. People in this stage often describe a profound sense of coming full circle. They remember who they were as children before the world taught them to be different. But now they can access that natural state as adults, with all the wisdom that experience has brought. There's a quality of innocence that's been regained, but it's an innocence informed by understanding rather than ignorance. This stage is characterized by deep gratitude for the entire journey, including the periods of confusion and lostness. You understand that even your mistakes and detours were necessary parts of finding your way home to yourself. The suffering that once felt pointless now reveals its purpose as the catalyst that began your search for something more real. Finally, we reach the 10th stage, entering the marketplace with helping hands. The final stage isn't about transcending the world, but about re-entering it with everything you've learned. You return to ordinary life, but now you bring with you the peace and wisdom you've discovered. You work, you love, you engage with daily responsibilities, but from a place of freedom rather than compulsion. Most importantly, you naturally become a source of support for others who are still searching. Not because you're trying to be a teacher, but because your presence itself is healing. People sense that you've found something real, and that gives them hope for their own journey. You don't need to preach or offer advice. Your way of being in the world becomes a teaching in itself. Now, one of the most comforting aspects of the 10 Bulls parable is understanding why progress isn't linear. The parable acknowledges the non-linear nature of inner development in a way that brings immense relief to anyone who's ever felt like they were going backward or getting stuck. You don't graduate from one stage and never return to earlier ones. Life has a way of cycling us through these stages repeatedly, each time at a deeper level. You might find your authentic self in one area of life while still searching for it in another. You might catch the bull in your career but still be looking for tracks in your relationships. You might experience profound clarity one day and complete confusion the next. You might feel like you've integrated your authentic self beautifully, only to have a major life change throw you back into searching mode. This isn't failure. It's how human consciousness actually develops in spirals rather than straight lines, with each return to familiar territory offering an opportunity for deeper understanding. Each time you cycle through the stages, you bring more wisdom, more compassion, more skillful means. The searching of a 50-year-old is different from the searching of a 20-year-old, even if it feels similarly uncertain. What makes this ancient teaching so therapeutic is recognizing how each stage serves as its own natural remedy. The parable normalizes every stage of the journey in a way that our achievement-oriented culture rarely does. Feeling lost isn't a problem to solve. It's the first stage of awakening. Being confused about your direction isn't evidence of failure. It's the beginning of finding your tracks. Even the struggle to integrate your authentic self into practical life isn't a sign you're doing something wrong. It's the natural process of catching and taming the bull. Each stage has its own medicine, its own gift, its own essential teaching. The searching teaches you to honor your longing and trust that something real is calling you. Finding the tracks develops your awareness and ability to recognize what's authentically yours. Seeing the bull builds your trust in your own direct experience. Catching it develops your courage to live differently. Taming it teaches integration and skillful means. The later stages cultivate surrender, wisdom, and compassionate action. Understanding where you are in this journey can bring immense relief. You're not broken or behind. You're not doing life wrong because you don't have it all figured out. You're exactly where you need to be, learning what you need to learn, developing the capacities that will serve you in later stages. Your confusion isn't a bug in the system. It's a feature of the awakening process. The parable also suggests that feeling lost is often a sign that you're ready for the next stage of development. Your confusion might be your psyche's way of saying that your current identity has become too small for who you're becoming. The discomfort is not punishment, it's preparation. It's life's way of creating space for something new to emerge. So when you feel like you don't know who you are or where you're going, remember the young herder starting his search. He doesn't know where his bull is, but he knows it exists. He trusts that it can be found. And he's willing to begin the journey even without a map, even without guarantees, even when everyone else thinks he's crazy for leaving the safety of the village. That willingness to begin, to keep searching, even when you don't know what you're looking for, is itself a profound spiritual practice. It's the courage to live as a question rather than demanding to be an answer. It's the humility to admit that you don't know everything about yourself yet, and the faith that the journey of discovery is worthwhile. Your bull is there, waiting to be found. The journey may be longer and more complex than you imagined, but every step is taking you closer to home. Not to a place you've never been, but to who you've always been beneath the conditioning, the expectations, and the false beliefs about who you should be. The 10 Bulls parable reminds us that getting lost is not a detour from the spiritual path. It is the path, and every stage, no matter how difficult or confusing, is exactly where you need to be to discover what's been waiting for you all along. Your authentic self, like the bull in the story, has never actually left you. It's just been waiting patiently for you to stop looking everywhere else and come home. Have you ever wondered why certain situations keep showing up in your life? Why you attract the same type of relationships, find yourself in similar conflicts, or notice patterns that seem to follow you no matter how many fresh starts you make? There's an ancient understanding in Buddhism that offers a gentle way to look at these recurring patterns. Not as punishment or proof that you're doing something wrong, but as seeds you've been planting without realizing it. Seeds that are now bearing fruit in your current experience. This teaching about karma isn't the popular version you might have heard. The oversimplified, what goes around comes around, that gets used to justify everything from traffic jams to tragedies. The Buddhist understanding of karma is far more nuanced and ultimately far more hopeful. The word karma simply means action, but it points to something profound about how our past actions, not just physical actions, but mental and emotional patterns, create the conditions for our present experience. Think of it as the most sophisticated psychology ever developed, one that traces the subtle connections between cause and effect across the landscape of a human life. When you understand how the past gently shapes the present, everything begins to make sense in a new way. That tendency to doubt yourself in important moments, it might be the fruit of seeds planted years ago when criticism felt like truth. That pattern of attracting people who need rescuing, perhaps it grows from seeds of finding worth through being needed. The way you sabotage yourself just when things start going well. This might bloom from old seeds that learn to associate success with danger. But here's what makes this understanding so healing. Recognizing these patterns isn't about blame or judgment. It's about seeing the intelligent way your mind has been trying to protect you, even when that protection has outlived its usefulness. Let me share a story that illustrates this beautifully. There was once a young woman who worked in the palace gardens of an ancient king. Every day, she would carefully tend to the exotic plants that had been brought from distant lands, each requiring different soil, different amounts of water, different care. One day, she noticed that despite her careful attention, one particular flowering bush remained stunted and sickly while all the others flourished. She tried everything: more water, less water, different fertilizers, moving it to various locations throughout the garden. Nothing seemed to help. Frustrated, she finally dug deeper around the roots to see what might be wrong. There, wrapped tightly around the main root system, she found an old piece of cloth that had been buried with the plant when it was first transplanted years ago. The cloth had seemed harmless at the time, perhaps even protective. But as the plant grew, the fabric had begun to constrict its roots, limiting its ability to absorb nutrients and expand. Carefully, gently, she worked to remove the old binding. It was delicate work because the roots had grown around the cloth, and removing it too quickly might damage the plant further. But once the constraint was gone, within days, the bush began to show new growth. Within weeks, it was thriving. Within months, it was the most beautiful specimen in the entire garden. The gardener realized that the binding hadn't been placed with malicious intent. Someone had wrapped the roots to protect them during transplanting. But what had once been protection had become limitation. The plant's current struggle wasn't caused by anything wrong with the plant itself. It was the natural result of old conditions that no longer served its growth. This is how our mental and emotional patterns work. The behaviors that feel automatic, the reactions that seem to happen without our choosing, the ways we protect ourselves, that sometimes protect us from the very things we most want. These often have roots that go back to times when they served us well. Maybe as a child, you learned that being perfect was the way to avoid criticism, so you developed patterns of perfectionism that now prevent you from taking creative risks. Maybe you learned that staying small kept you safe from jealousy or attack, so you developed patterns of self-diminishment that now keep you from fully expressing your gifts. Maybe you learned that trusting people led to disappointment, so you developed patterns of emotional armor that now keep out love along with hurt. These patterns aren't character flaws. They're intelligent adaptations to the conditions you once faced. But understanding how patterns become teachers, not prisons, requires a shift in perspective that can be profoundly liberating. When you start to see your recurring challenges as information rather than condemnation, everything changes. That anxiety that shows up before important presentations, instead of judging it as weakness, you can become curious about what it's trying to protect you from. That tendency to overcommit and then feel resentful, rather than berating yourself for poor boundaries, you can investigate what need the overcommitting originally served. This kind of investigation is like being an archaeologist of your own experience. You're not digging to prove yourself guilty of past mistakes. You're digging to understand the conditions that created your current patterns, so you can consciously choose whether they still serve you. The practice of noticing without judging becomes essential here. Most of us have been trained to notice our patterns only to criticize them. We become aware of our defensiveness, so we can shame ourselves for being defensive. We recognize our people-pleasing, so we can feel guilty about not being more authentic. But this approach just adds another layer of suffering on top of the original pattern. True awareness is different. It's more like how a scientist observes a natural phenomenon with interest, curiosity, and respect for the intelligence of the system being studied. When you observe your patterns this way, you begin to see their underlying logic, their protective function, their skillful aspects, as well as their limitations. Let's try this right now with something small. Think of a pattern in your life that you've been judging yourself for. Maybe it's procrastination. Maybe it's worry. Maybe it's difficulty saying no. Instead of immediately jumping to what's wrong with this pattern, ask yourself, what might this pattern be trying to protect me from? What need might it be attempting to meet? When did I first learn that this response was necessary? You might be surprised by what you discover. Procrastination often protects us from the vulnerability of not being perfect. Worry can be the mind's way of trying to maintain control in uncertain situations. Difficulty saying no might stem from early experiences that taught us that disappointing others was dangerous. None of this excuses harmful behavior or suggests you shouldn't work to change patterns that no longer serve you. But it does suggest that shame and self-attack are rarely effective tools for transformation. Understanding and compassion are much more powerful catalysts for change. When you understand that your patterns made sense given the conditions that created them, you can begin to make conscious choices about whether to keep them. This is where the real power of karmic understanding emerges. You realize that you're not just the result of past conditions. You're also actively planting seeds today that will shape your future experience. Every moment offers an opportunity to plant new seeds. Every time you choose awareness over reactivity, you're planting seeds of mindfulness. Every time you respond with kindness instead of defensiveness, you're planting seeds of compassion. Every time you speak honestly instead of saying what you think others want to hear, you're planting seeds of authenticity. But this isn't about becoming a perfect person who never has difficult emotions or challenging patterns. It's about becoming a conscious person who recognizes that they have choice in how they respond to life's inevitable difficulties. Think about Maria, who noticed that she had a pattern of becoming defensive whenever anyone offered her feedback. Instead of judging herself for this reaction, she became curious about it. She traced it back to a childhood where criticism felt like rejection, where making mistakes meant losing love. Her defensiveness had been a way of protecting her tender heart from what felt like attacks on her worthiness. Understanding this didn't immediately eliminate her defensive reactions, but it changed her relationship to them. Instead of being controlled by the defensiveness, she could notice it arising and make a conscious choice about how to respond. Sometimes she still reacted defensively, but increasingly she was able to pause and ask herself, what is this feedback actually offering me? How can I receive it without making it mean I'm fundamentally flawed? Over time, this shift in her internal response began to change her external relationships. People felt safer offering her honest feedback because they sensed she was genuinely interested in growing rather than just protecting her image. This created a positive cycle where she received more useful input, which helped her develop more skill, which increased her confidence, which made her less defensive. This is how new karmic seeds grow into new patterns. Not through force or willpower, but through understanding, compassion, and conscious choice, repeated over time. But there's something even more subtle happening in this process of working with karmic patterns. As you become more aware of how your past shapes your present, you also begin to see how interconnected all of our patterns are. Your defensiveness doesn't exist in isolation. It affects how others respond to you, which affects how they interact with others, which ripples out in ways you can't even track. This recognition can be humbling and empowering at the same time. Humbling, because you realize that so much of what you thought was just your personality is actually the result of countless causes and conditions. many of which were beyond your control. Empowering because you realize that your conscious choices about how to respond to life are contributing to the collective patterns that shape everyone's experience. When you choose patience instead of irritation with a difficult person, you're not just changing your own experience. You're planting seeds of patience that might affect how that person treats others. When you choose honesty instead of people-pleasing, you're creating conditions where others feel permission to be more authentic too. When you choose self-compassion instead of self-criticism, you're modeling a different way of being that others can learn from. This doesn't mean you're responsible for fixing everyone, or that you should sacrifice your well-being for others. It means that your inner work is never just personal. Your healing contributes to collective healing in ways both seen and unseen. There's a particular freedom that comes from understanding karma this way. You stop needing your past to have been different for you to be okay now. You stop needing to blame your parents, your culture, your circumstances for the patterns you're working with. Not because those influences weren't real or significant, but because blame keeps you stuck in the past, while understanding allows you to work skillfully with the present. You also stop needing to have perfect control over your future. You can plant seeds consciously and tend them carefully, but you can't control every condition that affects their growth. Sometimes the seeds you plant with such care don't seem to sprout. Sometimes unexpected flowers bloom from seeds you didn't even know you were planting. This is the humbling mystery of how change actually works in human life. The practice becomes one of showing up as consciously as possible to each moment, making choices that align with your deepest values, and trusting that this way of living will naturally create beneficial conditions over time. Not because you're guaranteed specific outcomes, but because you're participating in the ongoing creation of your life, rather than just being carried along by unconscious patterns. This shift from unconscious to conscious participation in your own unfolding is perhaps the most practical benefit of understanding karmic patterns. You begin to feel less like a victim of your circumstances and more like a collaborator with life itself. Your challenges don't disappear, but they become workable material for growth rather than evidence of failure. Even feeling lost begins to look different through this lens. Maybe your confusion isn't a sign that something has gone wrong, but rather a sign that old patterns of certainty are dissolving to make space for something new to emerge. Maybe your sense of not knowing who you are is actually your psyche's way of refusing to be limited by outdated self-concepts. The seeds of your current experience were planted by the conditions you've lived through and the choices you've made, both conscious and unconscious. But the seeds of your future experience are being planted right now, in this moment, by how you choose to meet whatever you're facing. You can plant seeds of awareness by noticing your patterns without immediately trying to fix them. You can plant seeds of compassion by treating yourself with the same kindness you'd offer a good friend who was struggling. You can plant seeds of courage by taking small steps toward authenticity, even when it feels risky. You can plant seeds of trust by believing that your sincere efforts to grow and heal matter, even when you can't see immediate results. These seeds might not sprout tomorrow or next month. Some of the most important changes in human life happen slowly, almost imperceptibly. But every moment of conscious choice, every small act of kindness toward yourself and others, every decision to respond rather than react, is contributing to the gradual transformation of your inner landscape. The old binding around the roots doesn't have to be cut away all at once. Sometimes the most skillful approach is the gentle, patient work of loosening what no longer serves, while honoring what those patterns once provided. The plant in the story didn't become beautiful overnight, once the constraint was removed. It took time for the roots to expand, for new growth to emerge, for the full potential to be realized. But every day of growth built on the previous day, every small expansion of the root system created conditions for further expansion. And eventually, what had once been the most struggling plant in the garden became the most magnificent. This is the promise hidden within your current confusion and challenges. They're not evidence that you're fundamentally flawed or behind where you should be. They're signs that old constraints are ready to be released, that new growth is trying to emerge, that the garden of your life is preparing for its next season of flourishing. The seeds of your experience, both past and future, are always being planted. The question is whether you're planting them consciously or unconsciously, with awareness or reactivity, with compassion or judgment. Every moment offers a fresh opportunity to choose what kind of garden you want to cultivate in the landscape of your life. There's a moment that comes to most people at some point in their lives when they look in the mirror and barely recognize themselves. Not because they've aged or changed physically, but because the person staring back doesn't match the story they've been telling themselves about who they are. Maybe it happens after a major life transition, a divorce, a career change, a loss that reshapes everything. Maybe it emerges more gradually, a slow realization that the identity you've been performing no longer feels authentic. Or maybe it arrives suddenly, in a moment of clarity where you see how much energy you've been spending trying to maintain an image that was never quite real to begin with. This can feel terrifying. If you're not who you thought you were, then who are you? If the story you've been living isn't true, what is? But what if this moment of not knowing, this sense of your identity dissolving, isn't a crisis at all? What if it's actually an opening into the most profound freedom you've ever experienced? This is where Buddhism's teaching on emptiness, or shunyata in Sanskrit, offers something revolutionary. Not emptiness as a void or absence, but emptiness as the most spacious, alive, and liberating way of being human. When Buddhist teachers talk about emptiness, they're not suggesting that you don't exist or that life doesn't matter. They're pointing to something much more subtle and ultimately more freeing, the recognition that you're not as solid, fixed, or permanently defined as you might think. That the boundaries you've drawn around yourself, the labels you've accepted, the story you tell about who you are, all of this is much more fluid than it appears. Think about it this way. Right now, as you listen to these words, millions of cells in your body are dying and being replaced. Your thoughts are arising and passing away moment by moment. Your emotions are shifting. Your breath is changing. Your awareness is moving from sound to sensation, to memory, and back again. What exactly is staying the same long enough to be called a permanent self? This isn't a philosophical puzzle. It's pointing to something you can observe directly in your own experience. The more closely you look for a solid, unchanging core of self, the more elusive it becomes. Not because there's something wrong with you, but because this solid self was always a mental construction, a useful story, but not an absolute truth. Understanding why solid identity creates suffering requires looking at how much energy goes into maintaining the image of a consistent self. Think about all the mental effort involved in being the same person from moment to moment, day to day. You have to remember who you're supposed to be, defend positions you took years ago, live up to expectations based on past versions of yourself. If you've identified yourself as the responsible one, you can't let yourself be spontaneous without an internal crisis. If you've built your identity around being successful, any failure becomes a threat to your very existence. If you see yourself as independent, asking for help feels like a betrayal of who you are. The more rigidly you define yourself, the smaller your world becomes. But here's what's particularly exhausting about trying to maintain a solid identity. It requires constant vigilance. You have to monitor your thoughts to make sure they're consistent with who you think you are. You have to filter your experiences to maintain your self-image. You have to defend against anything that might challenge your story about yourself. It's like trying to hold water in your hands. Possible for a moment, but ultimately futile and tiring. There's an ancient story that captures this beautifully. In a mountain village, there grew two trees side by side. One was an old oak, massive and strong, its trunk thick and unyielding. The other was a young bamboo, slender and flexible, bending gracefully with every breeze. The oak was proud of its strength and solidity. "Look at me," it would say to the bamboo during calm days. "I stand firm against every storm. I don't bend or sway like you do. I am strong, permanent, unmovable. That is what it means to be a real tree." The bamboo would listen quietly, continuing to sway gently, even in the lightest wind. It didn't argue with the oak, but it also didn't try to change its own nature. Where the oak was rigid, the bamboo remained fluid. Where the oak resisted movement, the bamboo danced with it. Then one winter, a massive storm swept through the mountains. The winds were unlike anything the village had ever seen. howling through the valleys with devastating force. The oak, true to its nature, stood firm and refused to bend. It fought the wind with all its strength, determined to prove its permanence and solidity. But the wind was stronger. As the storm intensified, the oak's resistance became its downfall. Unable to yield, unable to adapt, it finally snapped under the pressure. The great tree that had prided itself on its unchanging strength was uprooted and destroyed. Meanwhile, the bamboo bent so far in the wind that its top nearly touched the ground. It offered no resistance, no fight, no attempt to maintain a rigid form. It simply moved with the storm, allowing the fierce wind to flow around and through it. And when the storm passed, the bamboo stood upright again, unharmed, renewed, as alive as ever. The villagers who witnessed this understood something profound. True strength isn't about being unmovable. It's about being responsive. Real resilience comes not from rigidity, but from the ability to adapt without losing your essential nature. This is what emptiness offers, the bamboo's way of being human. When you stop trying to maintain a solid, unchanging identity, you discover a kind of strength and freedom you never knew was possible. You can bend with life's storms without breaking. You can adapt to new situations without losing yourself. You can change and grow without experiencing it as a threat to who you are. The relief of not being fixed is something you have to experience to understand fully. Imagine the exhaustion lifting when you no longer have to defend an image of yourself that was always too small anyway. Picture the freedom of being able to respond to each situation freshly, without the burden of consistency with past positions. Feel what it might be like to admit you don't know something without it threatening your sense of competence, or to make a mistake without it, meaning you're fundamentally flawed. This doesn't mean becoming wishy-washy or losing your values. The bamboo has its own nature. It doesn't try to become an oak or a pine tree, but it holds that nature lightly, expressing it through flexibility rather than rigidity. Similarly, you can have preferences, opinions, and values while holding them as living expressions rather than fixed definitions. When you begin holding yourself lightly, daily life becomes less effortful. You can disagree with someone without needing to prove you're right. You can receive feedback without defending your image. You can try new things without worrying about whether they fit your identity. You can change your mind without feeling like you're betraying your past self. Let's try a simple practice right now. Think of one way you typically describe yourself. Maybe, I'm an introvert, or I'm not creative, or I'm someone who doesn't like conflict. Now, instead of holding this as a fixed truth, try holding it as a pattern you've noticed. Instead of, I am this way, try, I have tended to be this way, or this has been true for me in certain circumstances. Do you feel the difference? The first version locks you into a box. The second creates space for change, growth, and new possibilities. It acknowledges your patterns without making them permanent. It honors your history without making it your destiny. This shift from identity to tendency, from I am to I have been, is one of the most practical applications of understanding emptiness. It creates what we might call developmental space, room for you to evolve without having to demolish your entire sense of self. Consider Sarah, who had always identified strongly as the helper in her family and friend groups. This identity served her well in many ways. It made her feel valuable and needed. But it also trapped her in patterns of giving until she was depleted, saying yes when she meant no, and attracting people who took advantage of her generosity. When she encountered the teaching on emptiness, she initially resisted it. If I'm not the helpful one, who am I? She wondered. But gradually, she began to experiment with holding her helpful nature more lightly. Instead of, I am someone who always helps others, she began to think, I have a gift for helping, and I can choose when and how to offer it. This small shift created enormous freedom. She could still be generous and supportive, but now, these qualities were choices rather than compulsions. She could say no to requests that would deplete her without feeling like she was betraying her fundamental nature. She could ask for help herself without experiencing an identity crisis. Her helpfulness became more skillful because it came from abundance rather than a desperate need to maintain an image. This is how emptiness works in practical life. It doesn't erase your qualities or make you bland and characterless. It liberates your qualities from the prison of fixed identity so they can be expressed more freely and skillfully. But there's an even deeper level to this teaching. As you become comfortable with the emptiness of fixed identity, you begin to notice the emptiness of all the things you thought were solid. Your problems, which once seemed so real and permanent, reveal themselves to be temporary conditions arising from causes. Your emotions, which once defined your days, show themselves to be passing weather in the sky of awareness. Even your thoughts, which once seemed like the voice of truth, become just phenomena arising and passing away. This recognition brings a profound sense of spaciousness. When you're not solid, you can't be broken. When you're not fixed, you can't be stuck. When you're not permanent, you can't be ruined. The very things that once felt like threats to your existence become simply experiences moving through the space of awareness. People sometimes worry that understanding emptiness will make them passive or unmotivated. If nothing is permanent, why bother trying to change anything? But this misses the profound activity that emptiness makes possible. When you're not spending energy maintaining a fixed self, that energy becomes available for genuine response to life situations. When you're not defending a position, you can actually listen to what's needed. When you're not attached to being right, You can focus on being helpful. The bamboo in our story wasn't passive. It was supremely responsive. It participated fully with each moment's conditions, while remaining free from the need to control those conditions. This is the kind of engaged freedom that emptiness offers. Not detachment from life, but intimate participation without clinging. This way of being becomes especially valuable during difficult periods. When you're going through a challenging time, the tendency is to make it mean something about your identity. I'm someone who struggles with depression. I'm not good at relationships. I'm the kind of person who always fails at this. These identity-based narratives add suffering on top of whatever difficulty you're already experiencing. But when you understand the emptiness of fixed identity, difficult experiences become just difficult experiences. They're not evidence of some fundamental flaw in your character. They're not predictions about your permanent condition. They're temporary weather patterns in the vast sky of your being, arising from causes and conditions, changing as those causes and conditions change. This doesn't minimize real pain or suggest you should be detached from your experience. It provides a framework for meeting pain without adding the extra layer of identity-based suffering. You can feel sad without becoming a sad person. You can experience anxiety without defining yourself as an anxious person. You can go through a difficult period without making it mean you're fundamentally broken. The freedom in emptiness is ultimately the freedom to be fully human without being trapped by any particular way of being human. You can be strong when strength is needed and soft when tenderness serves. You can be serious when the situation calls for gravity and playful when lightness is appropriate. You can be confident when you have knowledge and humble when you don't. You're no longer constrained by the need to maintain consistency with past versions of yourself. This fluidity doesn't make you unreliable or inauthentic. Like the bamboo, you maintain your essential nature while expressing it through appropriate responses to changing conditions. Your authenticity comes not from rigid consistency, but from genuine presence with whatever each moment requires. And perhaps most importantly for those who feel lost, understanding emptiness reveals that there never was a fixed self to lose in the first place. Your confusion isn't about having lost your way. It's about discovering that the self you thought you needed to find was always a construction. The freedom you're seeking isn't found by building a better, more solid identity. It's found by relaxing out of the need for any fixed identity at all. This is the deepest teaching of emptiness. You are not a problem to be solved or a project to be completed. You are an ongoing expression of life itself, as fluid and dynamic as a river, as spacious and changing as the sky. When you stop trying to freeze this flowing expression into a solid identity, you discover a freedom and aliveness you never knew was possible. The storm will come again. It always does. But now you know the secret of the bamboo. You can bend without breaking, change without losing yourself, and dance with whatever life brings, while remaining rooted in the spacious awareness that was never as small or solid as you once believed. Life has a way of bringing the same challenges back to your door, doesn't it? Just when you think you've learned the lesson, moved past the pattern, or healed the wound, something remarkably similar shows up again. Maybe it's a different person triggering the same insecurity, a new situation that brings up old fears, or another version of the same choice point where you seem to stumble every time. Your first instinct might be to feel defeated. Here we go again, you think. I thought I was past this. But what if these returning difficulties aren't evidence of failure at all? What if they're actually signs that you're ready for a deeper level of understanding? Buddhism offers a profound reframe for these recurring challenges through the concept of samsara, often misunderstood as an endless, meaningless cycle of suffering, but actually pointing to something much more hopeful. The cycles of difficulty in your life aren't circles that trap you in the same place forever. They're spirals that bring you back to familiar territory, but each time from a higher vantage point. Understanding cycles as spiral rather than circular changes everything about how you meet recurring difficulties. A circle brings you back to exactly the same place. A spiral brings you back to similar themes, but with all the wisdom you've gained from the previous round. You're not failing to progress. You're progressing through layers. Think about how a spiral staircase works. As you climb, you face the same direction multiple times, but each time you're higher than before. From the outside, it might look like you're going in circles, but from your perspective on the staircase, you can see that each revolution takes you to a new level. The view keeps expanding, even though the basic movement feels familiar. This is how healing actually works in human life. You don't overcome your deepest patterns once and for all in some dramatic breakthrough. You meet them again and again, but each encounter offers an opportunity to respond with greater wisdom, more compassion, deeper understanding. Sarah discovered this when she noticed her pattern of attracting relationships with emotionally unavailable partners. The first time she became aware of the pattern, she felt shame and tried to force herself to choose differently. When she found herself drawn to another unavailable person, she judged herself harshly for not learning the lesson. But as she began to understand the spiral nature of growth, her relationship to the pattern shifted. She realized that each iteration gave her new information about the underlying need this pattern was trying to meet. The first time around, she focused on changing her choices. The second time, she explored the childhood experiences that created her template for love. The third time, she worked on building the capacity to be with her own emotions instead of seeking rescue from others. Each cycle brought her deeper, not just in circles. Eventually, the pattern shifted naturally because she had addressed the roots, not just the symptoms. But this took several spirals, each one necessary for the complete transformation. This understanding becomes especially important when we encounter what Buddhism personifies as Mara, the inner adversary, the voice of doubt, fear, and resistance that seems to appear just when we're making progress. In traditional stories, Mara visits the Buddha not once, but repeatedly, trying to dissuade him from his path with temptation, doubt, and fear. Your personal Mara might show up as the voice that says you're not qualified just before you apply for a dream job. It might appear as sudden anxiety when you're about to make a commitment that aligns with your values. It could manifest as self-doubt right when you're gaining confidence, or cynicism just as you're opening your heart. The traditional approach to such inner adversaries is often to fight them, overcome them, or try to silence them entirely. But there's an ancient Tibetan practice that suggests a radically different approach, inviting your demons to tea. This isn't about indulging destructive impulses or wallowing in negative emotions. It's about recognizing that what we resist tends to persist, and what we meet with, awareness, tends to transform. When you invite your inner demons to tea, you're choosing curiosity over combat, investigation over annihilation. Let's try this right now with something manageable. Think of a difficult emotion or mental state that's been visiting you lately. Maybe it's anxiety about the future, sadness about a loss, or frustration with a situation that won't change. Instead of trying to push it away or solve it immediately, imagine inviting it to sit down with you. What would you say to this unwelcome guest? Maybe something like, "I see you there. I know you're trying to tell me something. What do you need me to understand?" Then listen, not for answers or solutions, but for the intelligence hidden within the difficulty. You might be surprised by what emerges. Anxiety often carries information about values you're afraid of violating. Sadness frequently holds love that has nowhere to go. Anger usually points to boundaries that need attention. When you stop fighting these emotions and start listening to them, they often reveal themselves as allies in disguise. The reason resistance creates persistence has to do with the basic functioning of human consciousness. Whatever you push against pushes back. Whatever you try to eliminate often grows stronger in the shadows. This isn't a character flaw, it's how the psyche protects itself from suppression. Think about what happens when someone tells you not to think about a white elephant. Immediately, your mind fills with images of white elephants. The instruction not to think about something actually reinforces the very thought you're trying to avoid. The same principle applies to emotions, patterns, and difficult experiences. Marcus learned this the hard way when he tried to overcome his tendency toward perfectionism through sheer willpower. Every time he noticed himself obsessing over details or procrastinating because something wasn't quite right, he would mentally yell at himself to just be okay with good enough. But the more he fought his perfectionist tendencies, the stronger they seemed to become. It wasn't until he began approaching his perfectionism with curiosity instead of combat that things started to shift. He began asking, "What is this perfectionism trying to protect me from? What would happen if I let something be imperfect? What fear lives underneath this need for everything to be just right?" Through this gentler investigation, he discovered that his perfectionism was rooted in a deep fear of criticism and rejection. It had been his way of trying to make himself bulletproof against judgment. Once he understood this, he could address the underlying fear with compassion rather than trying to eliminate the surface behavior through force. This brings us to the practical art of welcoming discomfort. This doesn't mean seeking out pain or pretending that difficult experiences are pleasant. It means developing the capacity to be present with discomfort without immediately scrambling to escape it. When discomfort arises, your nervous system has been trained to interpret it as danger and activate fight, flight, or freeze responses. But most emotional and psychological discomfort isn't actually dangerous. It's just unfamiliar, unwanted, or intense. Learning to distinguish between actual danger and mere discomfort is one of the most valuable skills you can develop. Start small. The next time you feel a mild frustration, maybe you're stuck in traffic or waiting in a long line, try breathing into the feeling instead of trying to distract yourself from it. Notice where you feel it in your body. Notice what thoughts accompany it. See if you can be curious about the experience rather than immediately wanting it to change. This practice builds what we might call discomfort tolerance, the ability to be with difficult experiences without being overwhelmed by them. As this capacity grows, you become less reactive to life's inevitable challenges. You can stay present with your partner during a difficult conversation instead of shutting down or lashing out. You can feel nervous about a presentation without letting the nervousness derail your preparation. You can experience sadness without needing to numb it or solve it immediately. There's a story that illustrates this beautifully. In a small farming village, there lived an old woman known for her unusual relationship with storms. While everyone else would board up their windows and huddle inside when dark clouds gathered, she would step onto her porch and stand calmly watching the approaching weather. Her neighbors thought she was foolish, even dangerous. "Why don't you take shelter like the rest of us?" they would ask. "Don't you see how destructive these storms can be?" The old woman would smile gently. "I've lived through many storms," she would say. "I've learned that they always pass, and they often bring exactly what the land needs." One particularly severe storm season, the village faced the worst drought in decades. The crops were failing, the wells were running dry, and people were beginning to panic. Then the storms came, massive, fierce thunderstorms that terrified everyone with their intensity. As usual, the old woman stood on her porch during each storm, watching peacefully as lightning split the sky and rain pounded the earth. Her neighbors, huddled in their homes, couldn't understand her calm presence in the face of such chaos. But when the storm season ended, something remarkable had happened. The violent rains had broken the drought completely. The lightning had started small, beneficial fires that cleared dead undergrowth and enriched the soil. The powerful winds had pollinated plants across great distances. What had looked like destruction was actually nature's way of restoration. "You see," the old woman told her neighbors as they surveyed their renewed landscape, "the storms were never the problem. Our fear of them was what made us miss their gifts. When you stop running from the storm and learn to stand with it, you discover that it often brings exactly what was needed." This is the wisdom of dancing with difficulty rather than fighting it. The storms of emotion, challenge, and change that sweep through your life often carry the seeds of necessary transformation. But you can only receive these gifts when you're willing to stand present with the intensity instead of immediately seeking shelter. This doesn't mean being passive in the face of genuine problems or accepting harmful situations. It means developing the wisdom to know when to take action and when to allow, when to change what you can, and when to find peace with what you cannot. When you begin to dance with difficulty instead of fighting it, you discover something remarkable. Many of the things you thought were obstacles were actually gateways. The anxiety that seemed like pure suffering reveals itself as sensitivity that needs honoring. The perfectionism that felt like a curse transforms into conscientiousness that seeks healthy expression. The sadness that seemed endless becomes a teacher about the depth of your capacity to love. But this transformation doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen through positive thinking or spiritual bypassing. It happens through the patient, repeated practice of meeting whatever arises with presence, curiosity, and compassion. It happens through learning to trust that your system has its own wisdom, even when that wisdom expresses itself through experiences you wouldn't choose. The spiral continues, bringing you back to familiar territories of challenge and growth. But now you know the secret. You're not going in circles. You're climbing. Each return to difficulty is an opportunity to meet it from a higher place of understanding. Each storm that seems to threaten your peace might actually be bringing the rain your inner landscape has been waiting for. So when the next wave of difficulty arrives, as it surely will, remember the old woman on her porch. Step out to meet it with presence instead of hiding in fear. Invite your demons to tea instead of trying to banish them. Trust that what feels like chaos might actually be the clearing that makes space for something new to grow. The dance with difficulty is not about learning to love pain. It's about learning to trust the intelligence of your own unfolding, even when it doesn't unfold according to your preferences. It's about becoming so rooted in presence that you can bend with life's storms without being broken by them. And it's about discovering that what you thought was your enemy might actually be your teacher in disguise. There comes a moment in every sincere search for meaning when words begin to feel inadequate. You've read the books, listened to the teachers, analyzed your patterns, and tried to think your way to understanding. But the deepest questions, who am I really? What is the point of all this? How do I find peace? These remain mysteriously untouchable by language. This is when many people feel like they're failing at their spiritual journey. If you can't articulate what you've learned, if you can't explain your insights to others, if you can't even think clearly about your own experience, surely that means you haven't understood anything at all? But what if this wordless place isn't a dead end? What if it's actually the threshold to a different kind of knowing altogether? What if the silence that emerges when seeking exhausts itself isn't emptiness, but fullness beyond description? Buddhism speaks of this as noble silence, not the silence of having nothing to say, but the silence of having touched something too profound for words. It's the silence that remains when all the concepts, explanations, and mental constructions fall away, leaving only direct presence with what is. Think about the moments in your life when words felt most inadequate. Maybe it was holding your newborn child, watching someone you love take their last breath, or standing before a sunset that stopped your mind completely. In these moments, language doesn't enhance the experience. It actually diminishes it. Any attempt to capture what's happening in concepts feels like trying to hold ocean water in a teacup. This isn't a failure of language. It's language meeting its natural limits. There are dimensions of human experience that can only be known directly, intimately, silently. And paradoxically, it's often in these wordless moments that the deepest understanding occurs. Noble silence offers something our culture desperately needs: permission to stop seeking long enough to notice what's already here. We live in a time of endless information, constant analysis, and the assumption that every question should have a readily available answer. But some questions aren't meant to be answered. They're meant to be lived. When you rest from constant seeking, something interesting happens. The mental agitation that drives the search begins to settle. Like mud sinking to the bottom of a glass of water, the churning thoughts and endless analysis gradually quiet, revealing a clarity that was always present underneath. This clarity isn't something you create through effort. It's something you uncover through non-effort. It's the natural state of awareness when it's not being stirred up by the constant need to understand, categorize, and solve. Maria discovered this during a particularly difficult period in her life. She had been struggling with anxiety and depression for months, reading every self-help book she could find, trying therapy, meditation apps, journaling exercises, anything that promised to help her understand what was wrong and how to fix it. But the more she analyzed her mental state, the more confused and overwhelmed she became. Every technique seemed to work temporarily, then stop working. Every insight felt profound for a day or two, then lost its power. She began to feel like she was failing at healing itself. Then one evening, exhausted from trying so hard to feel better, she simply sat in her garden without agenda. She wasn't meditating, wasn't practicing gratitude, wasn't trying to achieve any particular state of mind. She was just sitting, breathing, watching the light change as evening approached. For the first time in months, her mind became quiet. Not because she had solved anything or gained any new insights, but because she had temporarily stopped seeking solutions. In that silence, she didn't find answers to her questions about anxiety and depression. Instead, she found something deeper, the recognition that she was okay, even in the midst of not being okay. This experience taught her about becoming comfortable with not knowing. She realized that much of her suffering came not from the anxiety itself, but from her desperate need to understand it, control it, and make it go away. When she could rest in not knowing why she felt anxious, or when it would end, the anxiety became workable. It was still there, but it no longer defined her entire experience. Learning to be comfortable with not knowing is one of the most practical skills you can develop. It allows you to be present with uncertainty without immediately scrambling for false certainty. It lets you say, "I don't know," without feeling like a failure. It gives you permission to be human in a world that often demands impossible levels of clarity and control. Try this right now. Think of something you've been trying to figure out. Maybe a relationship issue, a career decision, or a personal pattern you can't seem to break. Instead of engaging with the thoughts about it, simply acknowledge, "I don't know what to do about this right now, and that's okay." Notice what happens in your body when you say this with sincerity. For most people, there's an immediate sense of relaxation, even relief. The pressure to have an answer lifts. The mental churning slows down. You're still in the same situation, but you're no longer at war with the uncertainty of it. This brings us to something subtle but profound, the space between thoughts. Most people experience their thinking as a continuous stream, one thought flowing directly into the next, without pause. But if you pay careful attention, you'll notice that there are actually gaps, tiny moments of silence between each thought. These gaps are where noble silence lives in ordinary experience. They're brief tastes of the awareness that exists, independent of mental content. In these micro moments of silence, you get a glimpse of what you are when you're not thinking about what you are. You can learn to notice and appreciate these natural pauses. Instead of immediately filling every silence with more thinking, you can rest in the spaciousness between thoughts. This doesn't require any special technique or years of meditation practice. It just requires paying attention to what's already happening. Over time, these moments of natural silence begin to expand. Not because you're forcing them to, but because you're learning to recognize and value them. You start to discover that silence isn't the absence of something. It's the presence of everything, without the filter of mental commentary. There's a story that captures this beautifully. A renowned teacher was invited to speak at a prestigious university about the nature of wisdom. Hundreds of professors, students, and intellectuals gathered in the largest auditorium on campus, eager to hear insights from someone considered one of the greatest minds of the time. The teacher walked onto the stage, bowed to the audience, and then sat down in meditation posture. The audience waited expectantly for the lecture to begin. 5 minutes passed in complete silence. Then 10 minutes. Then 20. People began to whisper among themselves. Was the teacher having a medical emergency? Had they forgotten where they were? Some people got up and left, frustrated by what seemed like a waste of time. Others stayed, but fidgeted restlessly, checking their phones and watches. But a few people in the audience began to settle into the silence. They stopped waiting for something to happen and started paying attention to what was already happening. They noticed the quality of their own presence, the spaciousness of the moment, the aliveness that existed even without words or concepts. After exactly 1 hour, the teacher stood up, bowed again, and walked off the stage without having said a single word. The audience was divided in its response. Many felt cheated, angry that they had wasted their time listening to nothing, but others understood that they had received the most profound teaching possible, a direct pointing to the wisdom that exists beyond words. The teacher later explained to closed students, "I could have spent the hour talking about wisdom, describing it, analyzing it, breaking it down into concepts they could understand and remember. But that would have been teaching about wisdom, not wisdom itself. Instead, I offered them the opportunity to taste wisdom directly, to experience the awareness that doesn't depend on thoughts or explanations." Those who were able to rest in the silence without needing it to be something else, the teacher continued, discovered something that no lecture could have given them. They touched the source of all understanding, the clear awareness that exists before concepts, beyond words, deeper than knowledge. This points to something revolutionary about how real wisdom is transmitted. It's not primarily through information or explanation, but through presence. When someone has genuinely touched the source of understanding, their silence often teaches more than their words. Their peaceful presence gives others permission to stop seeking and start being. You've probably experienced this yourself, though you might not have recognized it at the time. Perhaps you've been with someone who had a quality of presence that felt deeply calming, even when they weren't saying anything particularly wise. Maybe you've been in the company of someone whose silence felt more nourishing than most people's conversation. This is the teaching function of noble silence. It reminds others of their own capacity for peace. But noble silence isn't just something you receive from others. It's something you can cultivate and offer. When you learn to rest comfortably in not knowing, you become a source of permission for others to do the same. When you can be present without needing to fill every pause with commentary, you create space for deeper communication to emerge. This has practical applications in everyday life. Instead of immediately offering advice when someone shares a problem, you can offer the gift of listening silence. Instead of filling every awkward pause in conversation, you can allow the natural rhythm of communication to include moments of quiet. Instead of constantly explaining yourself, you can sometimes let your presence speak for itself. Noble silence also offers refuge from the overwhelming pace of modern life. In a world of constant input, opinion, and stimulation, moments of genuine quiet become increasingly precious. They're like clearings in a dense forest, spaces where you can rest, breathe, and remember what's essential. When you regularly return to these clearings of silence, you begin to carry their quality with you, even in noisy environments. You develop what we might call portable peace, the ability to access inner quiet, even when your external circumstances are chaotic. This isn't about being detached or checked out. It's about being so deeply present that you're not constantly reactive to surface disturbances. The deepest teaching of noble silence is that you don't need to understand everything to be at peace. You don't need to have answers to life's biggest questions to live with wisdom and compassion. You don't need to be able to explain your spiritual experiences to trust them. What you need is the courage to rest in the mystery, to be comfortable with the limits of conceptual knowledge, and to trust the intelligence that operates beyond the thinking mind. This intelligence doesn't speak in words. It speaks in presence, in appropriate action, in spontaneous compassion, in moments of clarity that arise when you're not trying to manufacture them. So when words fail, as they inevitably will, when you approach the deepest questions of existence, remember that this isn't a limitation. It's an invitation into a different way of knowing, a way that's more direct, more intimate, more alive than anything concepts could offer. In that silence, you might discover what the teacher in the auditorium was pointing to, the wisdom that doesn't need to be spoken to be real, the understanding that doesn't require explanation to transform your life, and the peace that's always available when you stop demanding that it announce itself in words. After all the seeking, all the analysis, all the attempts to understand your patterns and transform your life, you might find yourself in a familiar place, swinging between extremes. One day you're completely committed to change, meditating for hours, reading spiritual texts, analyzing every thought and emotion. The next day you're exhausted by all that effort and swing in the opposite direction, abandoning any attempt at growth and falling back into old patterns. Or maybe your extremes show up differently. You oscillate between being incredibly hard on yourself and then, recognizing that self-criticism isn't helpful, you swing to the other extreme of avoiding any honest self-reflection at all. You might alternate between trying to control every aspect of your life and then, when that becomes overwhelming, giving up and letting everything drift without any conscious direction. This exhausting dance between opposites is so common that the Buddha made it the foundation of his teaching about the middle way. But the middle way isn't what most people think it is. It's not a lukewarm compromise between extremes, not settling for mediocrity, and definitely not spiritual fence-sitting. where you avoid taking any strong positions. The middle way is something far more dynamic and alive. It's the art of finding balance not as a fixed position, but as a responsive dance with whatever life presents. It's learning to navigate between the extremes without getting trapped by either one. The Buddha discovered this principle through his own journey with extremes. Before his awakening, he had lived as a pampered prince, indulging in every pleasure and comfort available. When that left him feeling empty, he swung to the opposite extreme, practicing such severe asceticism that he nearly starved himself to death. It was only when he abandoned both extremes that awakening became possible. He later described this realization: avoiding these two extremes, the middle way gives vision, gives knowledge, and leads to calm, to insight, to enlightenment. But the middle way, he discovered, wasn't a theoretical concept. It was a lived understanding of how to meet each moment with appropriate response, rather than automatic reaction. Understanding the middle way as neither forcing nor giving up transforms how you approach every area of life. In your spiritual practice, it means you don't have to choose between aggressive self-improvement and passive resignation. You can engage with your growth actively, but without violence toward yourself. You can work with your patterns consistently, but without the frantic urgency that often sabotages real change. Think about how this applies to meditation, for example. The forcing approach would be sitting for hours trying to stop all thoughts, getting frustrated when your mind wanders, judging yourself for not being more concentrated. The giving up approach would be abandoning any attempt at formal practice because my mind is too busy, or I'm just not a meditation person. The middle way approach recognizes that meditation is like tending a garden. You plant seeds with intention, water them regularly, and remove weeds when you notice them. But you don't try to force flowers to bloom faster by pulling on their stems, and you don't abandon the garden entirely when some plants die. You work with the natural rhythms of growth while staying consistently engaged. This principle becomes especially valuable when dealing with difficult emotions. The forcing extreme would be trying to think your way out of sadness, analyzing it until you understand it completely, or pushing yourself to get over it according to some arbitrary timeline. The giving up extreme would be drowning in the emotion, identifying completely with it, or avoiding it through numbness and distraction. The middle way with difficult emotions involves what we might call skillful feeling. You neither suppress the emotion nor let it overwhelm you. You feel it fully while maintaining some spacious awareness around it. You let it move through you without making it mean something permanent about who you are. There's a story that illustrates this beautifully. In ancient Japan, there lived a master potter known throughout the region for creating vessels of extraordinary beauty and strength. Students would travel great distances to learn from him, hoping to discover the secret of his remarkable skill. Most students expected to learn special techniques secret glazes, or advanced methods. But the master's teaching was surprisingly simple. He would place a lump of clay in front of each student and say, "Show me how you would shape this into a bowl." Inevitably, the eager students would begin working the clay with great enthusiasm. Some would press and pound with tremendous force, trying to quickly shape the clay into the form they envisioned. These bowls would either crack from the pressure or become thick and clunky, lacking grace and refinement. Other students, having watched the first group fail, would try the opposite approach. They would barely touch the clay, being so gentle that they couldn't create any defined shape at all. Their bowls would remain formless lumps, too weak to hold anything. The master would watch patiently as student after student fell into one extreme or the other. Then he would take a piece of clay himself and begin to work. His hands moved with a quality that was neither forceful nor hesitant. He applied exactly the pressure needed in each moment, sometimes firm, sometimes gentle, always responsive to what the clay was ready to receive. "The clay has its own nature," he would explain as he worked. "Too much force and you break its integrity. Too little and you cannot help it realize its potential. The art is in feeling what it needs moment by moment and responding accordingly." His bowls were masterpieces, not because he had superior technique, but because he had learnt to dance with the material, rather than imposing his will upon it or being passive in the face of its resistance. He understood that creation happens in the space between forcing and giving up. This story captures something essential about how the middle way applies to personal transformation. You are both the potter and the clay in your own life. You need enough engagement to create positive change, but not so much force that you break your own spirit. You need enough gentleness to honor your natural rhythms, but not so much passivity that nothing ever shifts. Working with extremes gently becomes a daily practice. When you notice yourself swinging toward the forcing extreme, trying too hard, pushing too fast, demanding immediate results, you can consciously soften your approach. This doesn't mean becoming lazy or uncommitted. It means finding sustainable ways to maintain momentum without burning yourself out. When you notice yourself swinging toward the giving up extreme, avoiding responsibility, numbing out, or abandoning your intentions, you can gently re-engage. This doesn't mean being harsh with yourself for the lapse. It means compassionately returning to what you know serves your well-being. The middle way shows up in how you relate to your goals and ambitions. The forcing approach treats goals like military objectives that must be conquered through sheer willpower. The giving up approach abandons goals entirely, either because they feel too overwhelming or because wanting things seems unspiritual. The middle way holds goals lightly. You can work toward what you want while remaining open to how the path might unfold differently than you expected. You can be committed to your vision while staying flexible about the timing and methods. You can pursue meaningful achievements without making them the sole measure of your worth. In relationships, the middle way prevents you from swinging between the extremes of complete merger and total independence. You don't have to choose between losing yourself in others or protecting yourself through isolation. You can be intimate while maintaining your individuality, vulnerable while keeping appropriate boundaries, generous while honoring your own needs. Consider how this applies to dealing with criticism or feedback. The defensive extreme would be rejecting any input that challenges your self-image, becoming angry or hurt whenever someone points out a mistake or suggests an improvement. The self-attacking extreme would be accepting all criticism as truth, immediately assuming that any negative feedback means you're fundamentally flawed. The middle way allows you to listen openly to feedback without immediately believing or rejecting it. You can consider whether there's something useful in what you're hearing while maintaining your own discernment about what applies and what doesn't. You can use criticism as information without making it a verdict on your worth as a person. The middle way also transforms how you approach discipline and self-care. The forcing approach treats your body and mind like machines that should perform consistently, regardless of circumstances. You might push yourself to exercise when you're sick, maintain the same productivity levels, regardless of your energy, or expect yourself to be emotionally even all the time. The giving up approach abandons any structure or self-discipline entirely, interpreting every boundary as restriction and every routine as oppression. You might avoid exercise because it feels like pressure, abandon healthy eating because it seems too controlling, or resist any schedule because it limits your freedom. The middle way recognizes that true self-care involves both structure and flexibility. You can maintain routines that support your well-being while adapting them to life's changing circumstances. You can have boundaries that protect your energy while remaining responsive to genuine needs and opportunities. You can be disciplined without being rigid, spontaneous without being chaotic. This balanced approach becomes especially important when dealing with mental and emotional health. The forcing extreme might involve trying to positive think your way out of depression, suppressing anxiety through constant busyness, or demanding that you heal according to a specific timeline. The giving up extreme might mean identifying completely with your mental health challenges, avoiding any activities that might improve your mood, or using your struggles as an excuse to avoid all responsibility. The middle way acknowledges that mental health is influenced by both factors within your control and factors beyond it. You can take appropriate action to support your well-being through therapy, medication, lifestyle changes, spiritual practice, while accepting that healing often takes time and doesn't follow a linear path. You can work with your challenges without being defined by them. In your spiritual journey, the middle way prevents you from alternating between spiritual materialism and spiritual nihilism. You don't have to choose between obsessively collecting spiritual experiences and insights versus dismissing all spiritual seeking as self-indulgent nonsense. You can engage with teachings and practices that genuinely serve your awakening while maintaining healthy skepticism about spiritual claims and communities. The middle way also applies to how you hold your own progress. The forcing approach would be constantly measuring yourself against some ideal, becoming frustrated when growth is slow or uneven, treating every setback as evidence of failure. The giving up approach would be avoiding any honest assessment of your patterns, dismissing the possibility of change, or using spiritual concepts like everything is perfect as it is to avoid taking responsibility for harmful behaviors. The middle way allows you to honestly assess where you are while maintaining compassion for your humanity. You can celebrate progress without attachment, learn from mistakes without self-attack, and stay committed to growth without making it a burden. You can acknowledge that you're not perfect while recognizing that you're not fundamentally broken either. Perhaps most importantly, the middle way teaches you that balance isn't a destination you reach once and maintain forever. It's a dynamic process of constant micro-adjustments, like riding a bicycle or walking a tightrope. You're always making small corrections, leaning slightly one way or another in response to changing conditions. This understanding removes the pressure to find some perfect, permanent equilibrium. Instead, you develop what we might call balanced responsiveness, the ability to sense when you're moving toward an extreme and gently course correct before you swing too far. Some days you might need to lean more toward discipline and structure. Other days you might need more rest and flexibility. Sometimes you need to push yourself slightly beyond your comfort zone. Other times you need to honor your limits and scale back. The middle way isn't about finding one right approach. It's about developing the wisdom to know what each moment calls for. When you live from the middle way, you become less reactive to life's inevitable fluctuations. You don't panic when things get difficult because you know extremes are temporary. You don't get attached to peak experiences because you understand that all states pass. You develop a kind of inner stability that can bend with changing circumstances without breaking. This is the natural remedy that the middle way offers: freedom from the exhausting swing between extremes. Freedom to respond to each situation with fresh awareness rather than habitual reaction. Freedom to be fully human, neither demanding perfection of yourself nor settling for unconsciousness. Like the master potter, you learn to feel what each moment needs and respond accordingly. Sometimes that response looks like effort, sometimes like ease, sometimes like engagement, sometimes like letting go. But always, it comes from a place of presence rather than compulsion, wisdom rather than reactivity. The middle way doesn't promise that life will become easy or that you'll never feel confused again. But it does offer something perhaps more valuable: the capacity to meet whatever arises with appropriate response rather than automatic, extreme. And in that responsiveness, you find a kind of peace that doesn't depend on circumstances being just right, a strength that doesn't require force, and a wisdom that emerges naturally from staying present with what is. There's something your mind has been trying to convince you of your entire life that simply isn't true. It whispers this lie so consistently, so persuasively, that you've probably never thought to question it. The lie is this: that somewhere, somehow, you can find a state, a situation, a relationship, or a version of yourself that will remain stable and unchanging. This isn't a conscious belief. You know intellectually that everything changes. You've watched seasons turn, seen loved ones age, experienced your own body and mind shifting over the years. But there's a deeper part of you that keeps reaching for permanence, keeps trying to make something last, keeps fighting against the fundamental nature of existence itself. Understanding why permanence is the illusion your mind creates requires looking at how survival instincts shape perception. Your brain evolved to keep you alive in a dangerous world, and one of its primary strategies is to create the sense of a stable, continuous self moving through a predictable environment. This mental construction is useful for basic functioning, but it becomes a source of suffering when you mistake it for reality. The truth is that the person you were yesterday is not identical to the person you are today. Billions of cells in your body have died and been replaced. Your thoughts are different. Your emotions have shifted. Your understanding has evolved. Even your memories of yesterday have changed slightly in the act of remembering them. The continuity you experience is real, but it's more like the continuity of a river than the stability of a rock. This recognition can initially feel unsettling. If nothing is permanent, what can you count on? If you're constantly changing, who are you really? But as you begin to relax into the reality of impermanence, something remarkable happens. The exhausting effort to hold things together starts to release. The fear of losing what you have begins to transform into appreciation for what's here now. Learning to ride waves instead of fighting them becomes a daily practice in working with change. Think about what happens when you're in the ocean and a large wave approaches. If you brace against it, trying to remain exactly where you are, the wave will knock you down and tumble you around. But if you dive into it, or let it lift you, you can move with its energy rather than being overwhelmed by it. The waves of change in your life work the same way. When unexpected challenges arise, when relationships shift, when your plans get disrupted, you have a choice. You can exhaust yourself trying to keep everything exactly as it was, or you can learn to move with the current of change while maintaining your center. Maria discovered this when her company went through a major restructuring. For weeks, she fought against the uncertainty, spending sleepless nights worrying about whether she'd keep her job, trying to control outcomes that were completely beyond her influence. The more she resisted the situation, the more anxious and depleted she became. Then one morning, walking by a river on her way to work, she noticed how the water moved around obstacles. It didn't fight the rocks in its path or become frustrated by their presence. It simply flowed around them, sometimes creating beautiful eddies and pools, sometimes carving new channels, always moving toward its destination, but never in a straight line. This observation shifted something in her approach to the workplace uncertainty. Instead of fighting the restructuring, she began asking herself, how can I flow with this change while staying true to my values and goals? She started focusing on what she could influence: her skills, her relationships, her response to whatever happened, rather than what she couldn't control. When the restructuring was complete, Maria's position had indeed changed significantly. But instead of experiencing this as a defeat, she found that her new role actually aligned better with her interests and strengths. The change she had feared and fought against turned out to create opportunities she never would have imagined. This brings us to one of the most practical applications of understanding impermanence: developing a conscious letting go practice. This doesn't mean becoming passive or uncaring about your life. It means learning to hold your preferences, plans, and attachments lightly enough that you can adapt when circumstances change. Try this simple exercise right now. Think of something you've been holding on to tightly. Maybe a grudge against someone who hurt you, an expectation about how your life should look, or a version of yourself that no longer fits who you're becoming. Imagine holding this thing in your hands like a small bird. Notice how much effort it takes to keep your grip tight enough that the bird can't fly away. Feel the tension in your hands, the strain in your arms, the constant vigilance required to maintain control. Now imagine slowly opening your hands. The bird might fly away, or it might choose to stay. But either way, your hands are free. This is what letting go feels like. Not pushing away or rejecting, but releasing the grip. Allowing things to be what they are rather than demanding they be what you want them to be. Creating space for natural change to occur instead of trying to force specific outcomes. There's an ancient story that captures this wisdom beautifully. A young woman lived in a village beside a great river that had flowed through the valley for thousands of years. Every day she would sit by the riverbank and watch the water move past, carrying leaves, branches, and sometimes larger debris from upstream. The woman loved the river dearly, but she became increasingly distressed by its constant movement. "Why can't you stay still?" she would ask the flowing water. "Why must you always be taking things away and bringing new things I don't want?" One day, in frustration, she built a small dam across a narrow section of the river, trying to make the water stay in one place. For a while it seemed to work. The water behind her dam formed a peaceful pool that remained constant and predictable. She was delighted with her success. But within days, she noticed that the trapped water was becoming stagnant. Algae began to grow, insects bred in the still water, and an unpleasant smell started to develop. Meanwhile, Downstream from her dam, the riverbed was drying up, affecting the plants and animals that depended on the flowing water. Realizing what she had done, the woman dismantled her dam and allowed the river to flow freely again. As she watched the water resume its natural movement, she began to understand something profound. The river's beauty wasn't despite its constant change. It was because of it. The flowing water kept itself fresh and clean. It nourished everything along its banks, precisely because it never stayed in one place. It carved magnificent canyons and created fertile valleys through its persistent, gentle movement. Its power came not from being static, but from embracing its essential nature as flow. "I've been asking the wrong question," the woman realized. Instead of, "Why can't you stay still?" I should be asking, "What are you trying to teach me about how to live?" From that day forward, she approached her own life differently. When changes came, and they always did, she tried to flow with them like the river flowed around rocks. When losses occurred, she grieved them while also staying open to what new experiences might emerge. When her own thoughts and emotions shifted, she learned to watch them with the same acceptance she had developed for the river's movement. This story points to something revolutionary about how to find peace in motion. Most people think peace requires stillness, that tranquility can only be found in unchanging circumstances. But the river teaches us that true peace can exist within movement, that serenity is possible even in the midst of constant change. The key is learning to identify with the awareness that witnesses change rather than with the things that are changing. Your thoughts change, but the awareness that observes them remains steady. Your emotions shift, but the presence that feels them is constant. Your circumstances transform, but the consciousness that experiences them is like space itself, vast enough to hold everything without being disturbed by any of it. This shift in identification doesn't happen overnight. It's cultivated through repeated practice of noticing what changes and what remains constant in your experience. During meditation, you might observe how thoughts arise and pass away, while the awareness that notices them stays present. In daily life, you might notice how your roles and responsibilities shift, while the essential you that performs them remains. Understanding impermanence also transforms how you relate to difficult periods. When you're going through challenging times, the knowledge that this too shall pass isn't just a comforting platitude. It's a direct pointing to the nature of reality. No emotional state, no matter how intense, lasts forever. No situation, no matter how stuck it seems, remains unchanged indefinitely. This doesn't minimize the reality of pain when you're experiencing it, but it provides a larger context that can help you endure difficulty without being overwhelmed by it. You can feel the full intensity of grief while knowing that it will gradually transform. You can experience anxiety while trusting that it will eventually shift. You can be present with anger while understanding that it's a temporary weather pattern in the sky of your awareness. Equally important, understanding impermanence helps you appreciate good times without clinging to them desperately. When you're experiencing joy, love, or success, you can be fully present with these experiences without the underlying anxiety of trying to make them permanent. You can enjoy a beautiful sunset without being sad that it's ending. You can love someone deeply without needing guarantees about the future. You can celebrate achievements without defining your worth by them. This quality of non-clinging appreciation might be the most profound gift that accepting impermanence offers. When you stop trying to freeze frame the good moments, you can actually experience them more fully. When you release the fear of losing what you love, you can love more freely. When you accept that everything changes, you can be present with what's here now without the constant mental noise of trying to make it last forever. The practice of flowing with impermanence also develops resilience in a unique way. Instead of building resistance to change, you build flexibility. Instead of creating rigid structures that might break under pressure, you develop the ability to bend and adapt. Like the river that carves through mountains not through force but through persistent, gentle flow, you learn to navigate obstacles through responsiveness rather than resistance. This resilience serves you well in all areas of life. In relationships, you can love deeply while allowing others the freedom to grow and change. In work, you can be committed to your goals while staying flexible about methods and timing. In your personal development, you can work toward positive changes while accepting your humanity when you fall back into old patterns. Perhaps most importantly, embracing impermanence frees you from the exhausting project of trying to control life. You can still make plans, set intentions, and work toward goals. But you hold these efforts lightly, understanding that the outcome depends on countless factors beyond your influence. This doesn't make you passive, it makes you responsive. It doesn't make you uncaring, it makes you wise. When you finally stop fighting the river of change and learn to swim with its current, something beautiful happens. You discover that the movement you once feared is actually carrying you toward experiences, understanding, and growth that you never could have planned or imagined. You realize that the changes you resisted often brought exactly what you needed, even when they didn't bring what you wanted. The river of impermanence doesn't flow randomly. It moves according to deeper patterns and natural laws that your mind cannot always perceive, but your heart can learn to trust. When you align yourself with this flow rather than fighting against it, you find yourself moving not just through life, but with life as part of its grand, ever-changing dance. And in that dance, you discover a peace that doesn't depend on circumstances staying the same, a joy that doesn't require guarantees, and a love that grows stronger precisely because it doesn't try to possess or control. You become like the river itself, always moving, always changing, always flowing towards something greater than what came before. After all the work of understanding your patterns, finding your authentic self, and learning to navigate life's challenges, you might be surprised to discover that Buddhism points towards something even more liberating: the recognition that the solid, separate self you've been trying to improve might not be as real as you think. This isn't a denial of your existence or your experiences. It's an invitation into the most profound freedom possible. Freedom from the prison of having to be someone in particular. The teaching of non-self, or anatta in Sanskrit, is perhaps the most misunderstood concept in Buddhism. It doesn't mean you don't exist, that your feelings don't matter, or that you should become passive and detached from life. It means that the boundaries you've drawn around yourself, the story you tell about who you are, the identity you defend and maintain, all of this is much more fluid and constructed than it appears. Understanding what it means to go beyond the prison of identity requires looking at how much energy goes into maintaining the sense of being a consistent somebody. Right now, as you listen to these words, part of your mind is unconsciously monitoring whether what you're hearing fits with your self-image. Are you someone who's interested in spiritual teachings? Are you the type of person who has time for this kind of reflection? Do these ideas align with your beliefs about yourself? This internal editor is constantly at work, filtering experiences through the lens of identity. I'm not the kind of person who gets angry, so you suppress your irritation. I'm someone who has it all together, so you hide your confusion. I'm not creative, so you avoid artistic pursuits. These identity-based limitations create invisible walls around your experience. But who are you when you're not trying to be anyone in particular? Think about those moments when you're completely absorbed in an activity. Maybe playing with a child, helping someone in need, or simply walking in nature. In these moments, the constant self-monitoring often drops away. You're not thinking about whether you're being consistent with your personality or maintaining your image. You're simply present and responsive to what's happening. This natural state of unself-conscious presence is what you are beneath all the stories and identities. It's not that you become nobody. It's that you become free to be anybody, or more accurately, to respond to each moment without the constraint of having to be somebody specific. Consider this as a practical experiment in seeing identity as costume. Tomorrow, try spending a few hours consciously experimenting with different aspects of your personality. If you usually see yourself as serious, try being playful. If you identify as introverted, experiment with being more outgoing. If you think of yourself as practical, allow some whimsy into your day. You might be surprised to discover how naturally these foreign qualities emerge when you're not defending against them. The playfulness was always there, waiting behind the serious identity. The social ease was available beneath the introverted self-concept. The creativity was present under the practical persona. These weren't fake performances. They were authentic expressions that your fixed identity had been filtering out. This points to something revolutionary. You contain multitudes. The personality you think of as you is just one possible configuration of awareness, like one outfit in a vast wardrobe. When you realize this, you become free to choose how to show up in each situation based on what's actually needed, rather than what's consistent with your self-image. But there's something even deeper than this flexibility of identity. There's the awareness that watches all these different expressions, the consciousness that remains present, whether you're being serious or playful, introverted or outgoing. This awareness doesn't have characteristics in the way your personality does. It's more like space itself, present everywhere, containing everything, but never limited by what it contains. Learning to identify with this awareness, rather than with any particular content of awareness, is the heart of the non-self teaching. Your thoughts come and go, but the awareness that notices them remains. Your emotions shift and change, but the presence that feels them is constant. Your roles and responsibilities evolve, but the consciousness that experiences them is unshakable. There's a story that illustrates this beautifully. A young monk was struggling with understanding the teaching of non-self. If there's no self, he asked his teacher, then who is asking this question? Who is trying to understand? Who would become enlightened? The teacher led him to a room filled with mirrors of different shapes and sizes. Some mirrors were flat and clear, reflecting perfectly. Others were curved or tinted, creating distorted or colored reflections. Some were cracked, fragmenting the reflections into pieces. "Look around this room," the teacher said. "How many moons do you see?" The young monk looked carefully. It was nighttime, and the full moon outside was reflected in every mirror. "I see dozens of moons," he replied. "Each mirror shows a different reflection of the moon. Some clear, some distorted, some broken into fragments." "Now," the teacher asked, "if I were to remove all these mirrors, how many moons would remain?" "Just one," the monk answered immediately. "The real moon in the sky." "Exactly," the teacher smiled. "The mirrors are like individual minds, each reflecting the same universal awareness in their own unique way. Some minds reflect clearly, others are distorted by conditioning, some are fragmented by trauma or confusion. But the awareness itself, like the moon, is always one, always whole, always present. When you ask, "Who is asking this question?" you're looking at the reflection and thinking it's separate from what it reflects, the teacher continued. But the question arises in awareness, is heard by awareness, and is understood by awareness. There's no separate someone apart from this process. The monk suddenly understood. The sense of being a separate self was like mistaking the moon's reflection for the moon itself. Useful for practical purposes, but not ultimately true. The real freedom came not from improving the reflection, but from recognizing what was being reflected. This recognition doesn't eliminate your personality or make you identical to everyone else. Each mirror has its own characteristics, its own way of reflecting. Your unique history, temperament, and circumstances create a distinctive pattern of experience. But you're no longer trapped by thinking this pattern is all you are. When you understand yourself as awareness appearing as a particular person, rather than as a person who sometimes experiences awareness, everything shifts. Problems don't disappear, but they lose their solid weight. Emotions still arise, but they're weather patterns in the sky of consciousness, rather than definitions of who you are. Thoughts continue to come and go, but you're no longer obligated to believe every one of them. This shift brings immediate practical benefits. You become less reactive because there's less of a solid self to defend. You take criticism less personally because you understand that what's being criticized is just one reflection among many. You become more creative because you're not limited by narrow self-concepts. You relate more freely because you're not constantly managing an image. But perhaps the greatest gift of understanding non-self is the relief from the exhausting project of becoming someone. You can finally stop trying to fix yourself, improve yourself, or find yourself because you realize there was never a solid self there to begin with. What you are is already whole, already free, already perfect. Not in the sense of being flawless, but in the sense of being complete as awareness itself. This doesn't mean you stop growing or learning. The patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving continue to evolve. But now this evolution happens naturally, without the force and struggle that comes from a separate self trying to improve itself. It's more like a river flowing toward the ocean, not because it's trying to get somewhere, but because flowing is its nature. When you feel lost, understanding non-self offers the ultimate reframe. You weren't lost because there was never a fixed someone to lose track of in the first place. The confusion you've been experiencing isn't about not knowing who you are. It's about the gradual dissolution of false ideas about who you thought you had to be. This dissolution isn't a loss. It's liberation. Liberation from the burden of maintaining a consistent image. Liberation from the fear of not being good enough. Liberation from the pressure to have it all figured out. What remains when these burdens drop away isn't nothing. It's everything. The vast open awareness that was always your true nature. This awareness is what you are when you're not trying to be anything. It's present in your deepest sleep when there's no personality functioning at all. It's there in moments of intense focus when self-consciousness disappears. It's available right now, in this moment, as the space in which these words are being heard and understood. The teaching of non-self doesn't ask you to eliminate your personality or become a blank slate. It invites you to discover the freedom that was always there beneath your identities. the freedom to be fully human without being trapped by any particular way of being human. The freedom to respond to each moment freshly rather than from the limitations of who you think you are. This is the ultimate freedom because it's not dependent on anything external. It doesn't require perfect circumstances, enlightened understanding, or special experiences. It's available right now, in whatever condition you find yourself, because it's what you already are, beneath all the stories and struggles. The moon in the mirror was never separate from the moon in the sky. The awareness looking through your eyes was never separate from the awareness that illuminates all experience. When you truly understand this, you discover that you were never lost, never broken, never in need of fixing. You were always already free. You just forgot to notice. One of the most radical shifts in understanding that Buddhism offers is the recognition that suffering isn't happening to you as punishment for something you did wrong. It's happening through you as information about what needs attention. This doesn't mean all pain is good or that you should seek out difficult experiences. It means that when suffering arises, as it inevitably does in human life, it often carries wisdom that can guide you toward greater freedom. The Buddha's first teaching after his awakening was about dukkha, often translated as suffering, but more accurately understood as the unsatisfactoriness that permeates conditioned existence. He wasn't being pessimistic or declaring life meaningless. He was pointing to something practical, the recognition that our pain often signals where we're fighting against reality rather than working skillfully with it. Understanding dukkha as a feedback system changes everything about how you relate to difficult experiences. Instead of immediately trying to escape discomfort or blaming yourself for feeling it, you can become curious about what it's trying to communicate. Pain often arises at the intersection between what is and what we think should be. It's the signal that something in our understanding, expectations, or approach needs adjustment. This doesn't apply to all forms of pain equally. Physical pain that signals injury or illness requires medical attention, not philosophical reflection. Psychological pain that's overwhelming or accompanied by thoughts of self-harm needs professional support. But much of the emotional and psychological discomfort we experience daily, anxiety, frustration, sadness, anger, often contains valuable information about our inner landscape and how we're navigating life. Learning to listen to discomfort's wisdom requires developing a different relationship with unwanted feelings. Instead of immediately medicating, distracting, or analyzing them away, you can learn to sit with them long enough to hear what they're trying to say. This isn't about wallowing or becoming overwhelmed. It's about creating enough space around difficult emotions to receive their guidance. Think about anxiety, for example. On the surface, anxiety feels like pure suffering, with no redeeming qualities. But when you listen more closely, Anxiety often carries information about values you're afraid of violating, boundaries you need to establish, or situations that require more attention and preparation. The anxiety itself isn't the problem. It's often pointing towards something that actually does need your care. Consider how this applies practically. When you feel anxiety before an important conversation, instead of just trying to calm down, you might ask, what is this anxiety trying to protect? Maybe it's pointing to the importance of speaking honestly about something you've been avoiding. Maybe it's highlighting that you need to prepare more thoroughly. Maybe it's signaling that this relationship or situation has significance you hadn't fully acknowledged. The practice of using pain as teacher begins with changing your internal response when discomfort arises. Instead of your first thought being, how do I get rid of this? Try asking, what is this here to teach me? This simple shift from resistance to receptivity often allows the wisdom within the pain to emerge naturally. Let me share a story that illustrates this beautifully. There was once a traveling merchant who was crossing a vast desert with his caravan. On the third day of their journey, he stepped on a large thorn that pierced deep into his foot. The pain was excruciating, and his immediate impulse was to pull the thorn out and continue walking. But the desert guide, an old woman who had crossed these sands for decades, stopped him. "Wait," she said. "Before you remove it, look carefully at where the thorn is pointing." The merchant was confused and in pain. "What does it matter which direction a thorn points?" he asked impatiently. "I just want to get it out so we can keep moving." But the guide insisted, so the merchant looked down at his foot. The thorn had entered from the side and was pointing toward a direction they hadn't planned to travel. Following her gaze, the guide pointed toward a barely visible ridge in that direction. "That ridge," she said quietly, "marks where the old caravan route used to run before the big sandstorm 5 years ago. The water source we were planning to reach tomorrow was buried in that storm. But there's another spring beyond that ridge, closer than where we were heading, and more reliable." The merchant was skeptical. How could a random thorn injury provide guidance about their route? But the guide was experienced and had never led them astray before. Reluctantly, he agreed to follow the direction the thorn indicated. 2 hours later, they found the hidden spring, fresh, abundant water that would have taken them another full day to reach on their original path. Even more importantly, they discovered that their planned route would have led them into a severe sandstorm that was brewing on the horizon. The thorn had literally pointed them away from danger and towards safety. As the guide helped him remove the thorn that evening, she said something the merchant never forgot. Pain often points us toward what we need to pay attention to. Not because it enjoys hurting us, but because it's often the only way to get our attention when we're moving too fast or heading in the wrong direction. This story captures something profound about the intelligence that can be hidden within painful experiences. Sometimes, what feels like random suffering is actually guidance trying to redirect us towards something more aligned with our well-being. The key is learning when to trust this guidance and when to seek other forms of help. Knowing when to hold and when to let go becomes crucial when working with pain as a teacher. Some discomfort is meant to be felt fully and learned from. Other pain needs to be addressed through action, professional help, or medical intervention. Developing this discernment is one of the most important skills you can cultivate. Emotional pain that's proportionate to circumstances, that comes and goes naturally, and that seems connected to specific situations or relationships, often carries useful information. This is the kind of discomfort that benefits from the curious, receptive approach we've been exploring. You can sit with it, listen to it, and learn from what it reveals about your values, needs, and boundaries. But pain that's overwhelming, persistent without clear cause, or accompanied by thoughts of self-harm, requires a different response. This is when you need to hold your well-being as the priority and seek appropriate support. There's wisdom in knowing when pain is asking for attention and when it's asking for intervention. The teaching about suffering as messenger also helps you distinguish between pain and the story you tell yourself about the pain. The actual sensation of sadness, for example, might be quite manageable. But the story that, "I shouldn't feel this way," or "this means something is fundamentally wrong with me," can create layers of additional suffering that have nothing to do with the original feeling. When you can separate the pure experience of an emotion from the narrative about what it means, you often discover that the emotion itself has something valuable to offer. Sadness might be pointing to something you've lost that was precious to you. Anger might be highlighting a boundary that was crossed. Fear might be alerting you to something that genuinely needs your attention and care. This approach doesn't romanticize suffering or suggest that all pain serves a positive purpose. Some suffering is simply the result of illness, trauma, or circumstances beyond anyone's control. The teaching isn't that everything happens for a reason, but that meaning can often be found within difficult experiences when we're willing to look for it. The practice of receiving pain's guidance also requires patience. The wisdom hidden within difficult experiences doesn't always reveal itself immediately. Sometimes you need to live with uncertainty for a while, carrying the question of what this experience might be teaching you without demanding an instant answer. But over time, patterns often emerge. You might notice that your anxiety consistently arises in situations where you're not honoring your authentic values. You might see that your sadness often follows periods when you've been disconnected from people you care about. You might recognize that your anger frequently signals times when you need to speak up for yourself or others. These patterns become like an internal guidance system, helping you navigate life with more wisdom and skill. You learn to recognize the early signals that something needs attention before it becomes a crisis. You develop the ability to course correct based on emotional feedback, rather than waiting for external circumstances to force change. Perhaps most importantly, Understanding suffering as a sacred messenger transforms your relationship with your own humanity. You stop seeing difficult emotions as evidence of failure and start seeing them as evidence of aliveness, sensitivity, and care. You recognize that a heart that can hurt is also a heart that can love deeply. You understand that the capacity to feel pain is inseparable from the capacity to feel joy. This doesn't mean seeking out suffering or believing that more pain equals more wisdom. It means approaching the pain that naturally arises in human life with respect rather than resistance, curiosity rather than condemnation. It means trusting that even in your most difficult moments, there might be intelligence at work that your immediate understanding cannot perceive. The thorn in the merchant's foot didn't feel like guidance when it first pierced his skin. It felt like an obstacle, an injury, something that would slow him down and cause unnecessary difficulty. But by paying attention to where it pointed, rather than just trying to remove it as quickly as possible, he discovered that it carried information that quite literally saved his life. Your own thorns, the difficulties, setbacks, and painful emotions that seem to interrupt your journey might also be pointing towards something important. Something you need to see, understand, or change course toward. The question isn't whether you'll encounter these thorns. They're part of walking through the terrain of human experience. The question is whether you'll pause long enough to notice what direction they're pointing before you pull them out and keep walking. So here we are, at the end of this journey through ancient wisdom and timeless truths. But the most profound realization isn't something new you've gained. It's the recognition that you were never actually lost to begin with. The confusion, the uncertainty, the feeling of being adrift, these weren't signs that you'd wandered off some predetermined path. They were invitations to discover that the path is made by walking, that home isn't a destination, but a way of being present with whatever arises. As you carry these natural remedies forward into your daily life, remember that they work not through perfection, but through practice. The beginner's mind that finds wonder in ordinary moments, the middle way that navigates between extremes with grace, the understanding that change is your ally, not your enemy. These become part of how you move through the world. You have permission to be exactly where you are right now. Not understanding everything, not having it all figured out, not being further along than you are. This moment, with all its imperfection and uncertainty, is enough. If this journey has touched something in you, share a word or phrase in the comments. Something that will stay with you, something that shifted. Let others know they're not alone in this beautiful, messy process of being human. Take a breath now. Feel your feet on the ground. Notice that you're still here, still breathing, still capable of presence. That's not nothing. That's everything. You're already home.